Hey guys, tonight we are embarking on a rather shadowy and perhaps surprisingly gentle descent into the depths of ancient Greek mythology. Imagine yourself not basking in the golden sunlight of Mount Olympus, but standing on the misty, reedy banks of the river Styx. The air cool and still, the only sound the distant, mournful baying of a three-headed dog. We are journeying to the realm of the dead, the ancient Greek underworld, and we're here to meet its often misunderstood and surprisingly not always that terrifying ruler, the god Hades. Tonight we're going to explore why Hades was considered a surprisingly friendly god, or at least perhaps a significantly less villainous and more justly administered deity than his modern pop culture reputation might suggest. Now trying to successfully navigate the actual ancient Greek underworld, without a proper divinely appointed guide like Hermes Psychopompos, a magically protective golden bow, or at the very least a very polite and clearly articulated, "Excuse me, Mr. Cerberus, sir. Could you perhaps point me in the general direction of the less gloomy and preferably non-eternal torment-filled exit?" Your chances of a pleasant, stress-free, round-trip ethereal vacation package would be, let's just say, exceptionally, almost comically slim. And the king of this vast shadowy domain, Hades himself. He certainly had a reputation, but maybe just maybe it wasn't entirely the one you're thinking of. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as always, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from tonight and what the time is in your part of the world. It's always wonderful to see where these sleepy historical and mythological meanderings reach. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself once again, Egeria, transported by the gentle currents of sleepy historical curiosity, back to the world of ancient Hellas, that sun-kissed land of philosophers, heroes, and a dazzling, if often rather bewildering pantheon of gods and goddesses. But this time our focus is not on the bright, sunlit realms of Olympus, nor the bustling human city-states. Instead, we are peering into the shadows, into the chthonic depths, to consider the ancient Greek understanding of death, and the deity who presided over its domain, Hades. Now, when you hear the name Hades, what immediately springs to your modern mind? For many, thanks to centuries of later interpretations, popular culture and a perhaps unfortunate conflation with a certain other more malevolently inclined ruler of a fiery underworld from a different theological tradition, the image is often one of a cackling horned, fire and brimstone wielding villain. He's frequently portrayed as a sort of ancient Greek devil, actively seeking to ensnare mortal souls, plotting to overthrow his brother Zeus, and generally reveling in doom-gloom and all things unpleasant. Hades, Lord of the Underworld, gets a really bad rap these days, doesn't he? Modern movies, comics, and video games often paint him as this sneering, power-hungry, almost cartoonishly evil figure, constantly scheming to expand his territory or just generally ruin everyone's day with a plague of particularly grumpy skeletal warriors. But the ancient Greeks' Egeria, their view of Hades, while certainly imbued with awe and a natural human fear of death itself, was often a bit more nuanced. And as our title tonight rather provocatively suggests, perhaps even surprisingly less overtly hostile than you might expect. A mainstream historical fact is that in ancient Greek mythology, Hades, whose name Idoneus likely means the unseen one or the invisible, was one of the three great sons of the Titans, Cronus and Rhea, his brothers being Zeus, king of the gods, ruler of the sky, and Poseidon, ruler of the sea. After they overthrew their father Cronus, these three brothers famously drew lots to divide the cosmos amongst themselves. Zeus got the heavens, Poseidon the seas, and Hades, well, Hades drew the rather less glamorous, distinctly subterranean, and generally not as popular for summer vacation short straw, the underworld, the realm of the dead. While his domain was undoubtedly feared as the inevitable gloomy destination of all mortal souls, Hades himself was typically portrayed by the ancient Greeks not as an actively evil or demonic figure akin to a later Christian devil, but rather as a stern, just unyielding, and often rather aloof custodian of the dead. His primary job wasn't to tempt mortals to sin or to actively cause suffering, but simply to ensure that the dead stayed dead, that they remained within the bounds of his realm, and that the cosmic order between the living and the deceased was maintained. The Greek underworld itself, often also called Hades after its ruler, was generally conceived as a vast, shadowy, misty place located deep beneath the earth. or perhaps at the furthest, gloomiest edges of the world. It wasn't necessarily a place of universal fiery torment for everyone who ended up there, as some later conceptions of hell might suggest. It had different regions, perhaps the mournful asphodel meadows, where the shades of ordinary mortals wandered aimlessly like forgotten dreams. The blessed Elysian fields, or Isles of the Blessed, a kind of paradise reserved for exceptional heroes and the especially virtuous. And of course, Tartarus, a deep, dark abyss even further below Hades, which was a place of eternal punishment, but specifically for the truly wicked, the Titans who had opposed the gods, or those mortals who had committed particularly heinous offenses against divine law like Tantalus or Sisyphus. Hades ruled over all of this, but he wasn't personally stoking the fires of Tartarus or cackling with glee at the suffering of ordinary shades. That wasn't really his department. One of the reasons Hades might be considered surprisingly friendly, or perhaps more accurately, surprisingly less meddlesome than his Olympian siblings, is that he generally stayed in his own realm and minded his own business. Unlike his brother Zeus, who was notorious for his constant amorous escapades among mortals, and his frequent, often rather disruptive interventions in human affairs. Or his other brother Poseidon, whose divine temper tantrums could cause earthquakes and sea storms. Hades was usually depicted as a rather more aloof and home-bodied deity. He rarely ventured up into the world of the living, and when he did, it was often for specific, usually rather serious reasons, like for example his famous and rather controversial acquisition of a queen, which we will definitely explore later. For the most part, his primary concern was the orderly administration of his own vast shadowy kingdom, ensuring that the souls of the dead arrived safely, courtesy of Hermes Psychopompos, the divine soul guide, and crucially that none of them tried to sneak back out. He was less an active agent of evil and more a very stern, very efficient, and entirely incorruptible cosmic immigration officer for the afterlife. The extent to which the ancient Greeks genuinely viewed Hades with a sense of personal active terror directed at the god himself versus a more generalized, deeply ingrained awe and profound respect for the inescapable power of death and the mysterious chthonic underworld realm that he governed. And how this complex perception might have varied across different regions of Greece, different social classes, or different historical periods within ancient Greek civilization remains a subtle and complex area of ongoing study for historians of Greek religion, mythology, and popular belief systems. It is true that the ancient Greeks were generally quite reluctant to speak Hades' name directly. They often referred to him using euphemisms or descriptive epithets such as Plauton the Rich One, or Giver of Wealth, referring to the mineral riches and agricultural fertility that come from beneath the earth. Clymenus the Renowned, or the Illustrious. Polydegmon, Receiver of Many, or simply Idoneus, the Unseen One. This avoidance of his direct name, however, likely stemmed more from a natural human fear and awe of death itself, and a superstitious reluctance to attract the attention of the Lord of the Dead, unnecessarily, rather than from a belief that Hades himself was an actively malevolent deity constantly seeking to harm the living. You probably wouldn't casually invite Hades to your average Olympian toga party up on Mount Olympus Egeria. Not because he was necessarily inherently evil or likely to start a divine food fight with a volley of flaming skulls, but simply because, well, he was a bit of a downer, wasn't he? The Lord of the Dead doesn't exactly scream life and soul of the party. Having a good time there? Hades enjoying the nectar and ambrosia? Zeus might jovially inquire. Hades, after a long, thoughtful silence, might reply in a deep, resonant voice, "All mortals, brother, however merry they may be, now eventually come to my realm. The fun, you see, is demonstrably finite." Yeah, probably not the kind of guest you'd want to seat next to a particularly cheerful nymph or a slightly insecure minor deity. So as we begin our gentle descent into the shadowy realms of Greek mythology, Egeria try to set aside those modern fire and brimstone images of a cackling demonic Hades. Instead, let us prepare to meet a more ancient, more complex, and perhaps, in his own stern, unyielding, and remarkably consistent way, a surprisingly just and not entirely unfriendly ruler of the inevitable. The whispers of his true nature and the secrets of his realm await our sleepy contemplation. You are now beginning, Egeria, to gently peel back the layers of modern misconception that have so often shrouded Hades, the ancient Greek lord of the dead, in an undeserved cloak of pure villainy. You understand that his primary role as assigned by the cosmic lottery after the Titanomachy was not one of active, malevolent evil, but rather that of a stern, unyielding, and largely impartial custodian of the vast, shadowy realm beneath the earth. He was less a cackling demon, delighting in torment, and more a very serious, very efficient, and entirely incorruptible divine administrator, overseeing a kingdom to which all mortals sooner or later were destined to arrive. But what was this kingdom actually like, this gloomy domain that bore its ruler's very name? Let us now take a sleepy, cautious descent into the mythical geography of Hades, the Greek underworld itself. A mainstream historical fact is that the ancient Greek conception of the underworld often referred to simply as Hades, after its king was a complex, multi-layered, and evolving realm. It wasn't a monolithic hell of eternal fire and brimstone for all, as later Christian theology would depict its place of punishment. Rather, it was the universal, inevitable destination of all deceased mortal souls, a vast, shadowy kingdom with distinct regions catering, as it were, to different categories of the departed. Your journey there, Egeria, as a newly departed soul or psyche, a breath a shade of your former self, would typically begin under the guidance of Hermes Psychopompos, Hermes the soul guide. This fleet-footed messenger god with his winged sandals and traveler's hat had the solemn duty of escorting the newly deceased from the world of the living to the very gates of the underworld. Imagine his gentle, if perhaps slightly hurried presence as he leads you through a dimming landscape towards the reedy, mist-shrouded banks of a great dark river. This is likely the river Styx, the hateful river, whose waters were so sacred that even the gods swore their most unbreakable oaths upon it. Or perhaps it is the Acheron, the river of woe. Here you would encounter another famous and famously grumpy denizen of the underworld, Charon, the ancient grizzled ferryman. His job for countless eons has been to pilot his rickety spectral boat across the dark waters, carrying the shades of the dead to the further shore. But Charon Egeria does not work for free. He had a very strict, non-negotiable, no obol, no entry policy for crossing the river Styx. It's like the ancient Greek equivalent of a very exclusive, very dimly lit, and decidedly one-way nightclub, with a mandatory one-coin cover charge, but the music is mostly mournful, echoing groans. The dress code is recently deceased and preferably still slightly bewildered, and there's absolutely no chance of getting a VIP table with bottle service. That one obol, a small silver coin, was traditionally placed in the mouth of the deceased by their relatives during the funeral rites. Those unfortunate souls who were improperly buried, or whose families had forgotten this crucial fare, were doomed to wander 100 years as restless shades on the near bank, unable to cross a truly pitiable fate. Once across the river, you would arrive at the very gates of Hades' domain, and here you would meet its most famous and arguably most terrifying guardian, Cerberus, the monstrous three-headed hound. His task was simple but crucial to prevent the dead from escaping back into the world of the living, and to deter any unauthorized living mortals from trying to sneak in, though a few particularly determined heroes, as we shall see, did manage it, usually with a great deal of divine assistance or cunning. Cerberus, with his multiple snarling heads, his serpent's tail, and perhaps even a mane of writhing snakes, was a formidable deterrent indeed. Beyond the gates, the kingdom of Hades itself unfolds, a vast, shadowy, and often rather melancholic expanse. It is generally depicted as being located deep beneath the earth, a place of perpetual twilight mist and silence, broken only by the flitting of shades and the distant mournful sounds of its 5 great rivers: the Styx, hate, oaths, the Acheron, woe, the Lethe. Forgetfulness, whose waters, if drunk, would erase all memory of one's former life. The Cocytus wailing, and the Phlegathon or Pyriphlegathon. The river of fire, which often surrounded Tartarus, the place of punishment. The precise geographical and cosmological conceptions of the Greek underworld, and the consistency of its various described regions, inhabitants, and even its exact location, whether purely subterranean or perhaps in the far western edges of the world, near the stream of Oceanus, and how these conceptions might have varied across different literary sources, from the early epic poems of Homer and Hesiod, to the philosophical dialogues of Plato, to the later, more systematized accounts by Roman poets like Virgil, and also across diverse local cult beliefs and folk traditions. Throughout ancient Greece, continue to be meticulously analyzed and debated by classicists and scholars of comparative mythology. Within this vast domain, there were several distinct regions. The largest and perhaps most neutral was the Asphodel Meadows. This was the rather bland, uneventful afterlife destination for the vast majority of ordinary souls, those who had been neither particularly virtuous nor exceptionally wicked in their lives. Here the shades of these common dead would wander aimlessly like flitting bats or dried leaves, often depicted as having lost much of their memory, their personality, and their vital force. They were not being actively tormented, but their existence was a dim, joyless, almost mindless continuation, a pale echo of their former lives. The Asphodel Meadows were the average, entirely unremarkable souls of ancient Greece were destined to spend eternity being average, entirely unremarkable, and probably quite bored. It's not actively terrible, you understand. It's certainly not great. It's just eternally uninspiringly beige, like a divine waiting room, with no interesting magazines, no complimentary celestial snacks, and really, really weak, almost non-existent otherworldly Wi-Fi. A quirky or fringe tidbit from Homer's Odyssey is that when Odysseus visits the underworld and encounters the shades in the Asphodel Meadows, they are depicted as being desperately thirsty and craving libations of blood from the living to temporarily regain a fleeting semblance of consciousness, memory, and the ability to speak coherently. It's like they needed a potent, ghostly energy drink, preferably with a strong iron supplement, just to muster the effort for a decent, if somewhat melancholic conversation. Then there were the Elysian Fields or Elysium, sometimes also referred to as the Isles of the Blessed. This was the ancient Greek equivalent of paradise, a blissful, sunlit realm within the underworld, or sometimes located in a far western earthly paradise reserved for exceptional heroes, the truly virtuous, those who were especially favored by the gods, or those initiated into certain mystery cults. Here they would enjoy an eternity of happiness, feasting, music, and pleasant pursuits. Hades, it should be remembered, ruled over this delightful region too, even if he didn't personally hang out there sipping nectar with the blessed heroes. And finally, there was Tartarus, the deepest, darkest, most terrifying abyss of the underworld, located as far beneath Hades as Hades was beneath the earth. This was the true place of punishment, a cosmic prison reserved for the greatest sinners, the Titans, who had warred against Zeus and those mortals who had committed truly heinous offenses against the gods or divine law. Figures like Sisyphus condemned to eternally roll his boulder, Tantalus forever tormented by unreachable food and drink, and Ixion bound to a perpetually spinning fiery wheel. While Hades was the overall ruler of the entire underworld, the actual administration of torment in Tartarus was often seen as being overseen by other chthonic entities, such as the Aranyes, the Furies, those ancient avenging goddesses who relentlessly pursued and punished oath-breakers, murderers of kin, and other grave offenders. Hades himself, along with his queen, Persephone, whose rather dramatic arrival in the underworld we will certainly discuss, resided in a grand, if undoubtedly rather gloomy palace, perhaps made of obsidian or other dark, precious subterranean materials. It was from here that he administered his vast silent kingdom, ensuring that the laws of death were upheld, that souls arrived and stayed where they belonged, and that the delicate balance between the world of the living and the realm of the shades was maintained. His jobbage area was essentially one of monumental, eternal cosmic crowd control and meticulous record-keeping for the deceased. All right, folks, keep it moving along the Styx, no loitering by the banks of the river Lethe trying to forget your unpaid mortal debts. Please try not to awaken Cerberus from his hopefully synchronized three-headed nap. And for Zeus's sake, if your divine judgment paperwork clearly indicates you're supposed to be in Tartarus for that rather unfortunate incident involving the stolen gold and apples and the accidental trampling of Hera's prize-winning peacock, please proceed directly to eternal torment, and do not attempt to sneak into the Elysian Fields for the ambrosia buffet and the all-day poetry slam. We have rules here, you know. This isn't some chaotic, unregulated afterlife. His realm was one of impartiality, not active malicious evil. It was the inevitable shadowy and ultimately well-ordered domain of the dead. You have now, Egeria, taken a sleepy, spectral tour through the vast, shadowy, and surprisingly well-organized domain of Hades, king of the underworld. You've navigated past Charon's gloomy ferry, and Cerberus's triple-headed vigilance wandered through the blandly eternal Asphodel Meadows, where ordinary shades flit like forgotten dreams, glimpsed the distant blissful light of the Elysian Fields, and perhaps even shivered slightly at the thought of the deep, dark abyss of Tartarus where the truly wicked endure their endless divinely ordained punishments. You understand that this realm, while certainly not a cheerful holiday destination, was conceived by the ancient Greeks not as a place of universal active torment inflicted by a malevolent ruler, but more as the inevitable, impartial, and orderly final destination for all mortal souls. But how did Hades, this stern and often rather misunderstood deity, actually end up with this particular and arguably least desirable piece of cosmic real estate? Was it a job he actively campaigned for? Did he perhaps have a particular passion for subterranean interior design and the management of large, silent populations? The answer, as with so many things in Greek mythology, involves a rather dramatic backstory of cosmic warfare and a fateful game of chance. Our story begins, as so many Greek myths do, with some serious family drama among the gods. Before Zeus and his Olympian siblings reigned supreme, the universe was ruled by their father Cronus and the other mighty titans. Cronus, however, had a rather nasty habit born of a prophecy that he would be overthrown by one of his own children. He swallowed each of his offspring as soon as they were born. Gabi, ancient Greek divine family dinners were often tense. His wife, Rhea, understandably upset by this ongoing paternal snack time, managed to save her youngest son Zeus by tricking Cronus into swallowing a stone wrapped in swaddling clothes instead. Zeus was then raised in secret on the island of Crete. When Zeus grew to manhood, he along with his now regurgitated thanks to a clever emetic potion. Older siblings, Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Poseidon, and our main character for tonight, Hades, launched a cataclysmic, universe-shaking rebellion against Cronus and the other titans. This was the Titanomachy, the Great War of the Gods, a conflict that raged for 10 long, earth-shattering years. During this epic struggle, Hades, though perhaps less frequently celebrated in heroic verse for his martial exploits than the thunderbolt-wielding Zeus or the trident-brandishing Poseidon, played his own crucial part. The three Cyclopes, ancient smith gods whom Zeus had freed from Tartarus, forged powerful weapons for the Olympian brothers to aid their cause. Zeus received the lightning bolt, Poseidon the trident, and Hades was gifted a truly remarkable and fitting piece of divine accoutrement. The Helm of Darkness, also known as the Cap of Invisibility, Kineae. This magical helmet, when worn, rendered its wearer completely unseen by gods and mortals alike. Hades used this helm to great effect during the Titanomachy, engaging in stealthy reconnaissance, sowing confusion among the Titan ranks, and generally being a very effective, if entirely invisible, divine special operative. Finally, after a decade of titanic, literally struggle often involving the hundred-handed giants, the Hecaton chairs, also freed by Zeus, hurling mountains with joyous abandon, the Olympian gods emerged victorious. The defeated Titans were cast down into the gloomy depths of Tartarus, securely imprisoned for all eternity. With peace, or at least a new divine order established, it was time for the three victorious brothers, Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades, to divide the conquered cosmos amongst themselves. A mainstream historical fact prominently recounted in ancient Greek mythological sources such as Hesiod's Theogony, which details the birth of the gods, and the Titanomachy, and Apollodorus's Bibliotheca, a later but invaluable compendium of myths, is that after their victory, these three great sons of Cronus and Rhea decided to apportion the major realms of the universe, the sky, the sea, and the underworld, by drawing lots. The earth itself and Mount Olympus, the home of the gods, were generally considered to be common territory, though Zeus, as the new king of the gods, held ultimate authority. So imagine the scene: Egeria, the three mighty brothers, still perhaps a little dusty and singed from their recent cosmic warfare, gather for this momentous, universe-defining raffle. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that the specific lots they used for this crucial division are not usually described in detail in the myths. One can only imagine the high-stakes divine game of chance. Perhaps they drew marked stones from a golden helmet, or cast knuckle bones onto a sacred shield, or engaged in some other suitably solemn binding, an entirely impartial method for determining who got which third of creation. The fate of the entire universe, Egeria, was essentially decided by a kind of celestial coin toss, or perhaps a very exclusive three-player game of rock, papyrus, scissors, divine addition. And the outcome of this cosmic lottery? Zeus, perhaps through divine luck, or maybe because he was, after all, Zeus drew the sky and the heavens, thereby becoming the supreme ruler of gods and mortals, his throne established on Mount Olympus. Poseidon drew the vast, restless, and often rather tempestuous domain of the sea, And Hades, well, Hades, it seems, drew the short straw. He was allotted the dark, gloomy, subterranean realm of the Underworld, the kingdom of the dead, the place from which no mortal soul, once it had crossed the river Styx, could ever truly return. So after all that epic universe-shattering warfare, the heroic battles, the freeing of the Cyclopes, the hurling of mountains, and the general vanquishing of ancient tyrannical cosmic powers, Zeus gets the prime penthouse suite with the stunning celestial views and overall management rights. Mount Olympus in the sky. Poseidon gets the magnificent sprawling beachfront property with excellent surfing conditions and unlimited access to all the best seafood the sea. And Hades, he gets the basement. A very large, very gloomy, eternally shadowy, and almost entirely unrenovated basement filled with an ever-increasing number of rather morose, distinctly unchatty, and generally quite disgruntled ghostly tenants. Oh joy, Hades probably muttered under his divine breath, looking at his newly acquired, distinctly subterranean real estate portfolio. Thanks, brothers. Really, really appreciate you saving the prime sun-drenched, soul-crushing darkness of the Underworld just for me. No, honestly, it's easy. And the property values are remarkably stable, I suppose, given the guaranteed occupancy rates. This Egeria is crucial to understanding Hades' character as perceived by the ancient Greeks. He did not choose to be the Lord of the Dead. He did not actively campaign for the position, nor did he seize it through conquest or cunning. It was his allotted portion, his fated domain assigned to him by the impartial mechanism of the lots. This sense of him being a reluctant king, or at least a king ruling over a realm that was inherently undesirable and largely joyless, contributes significantly to the idea that he was not an actively malevolent or evil deity. He was simply doing his job, fulfilling his assigned, if somewhat thankless, cosmic duty. His role was to rule the dead to ensure they stayed within the bounds of his kingdom, and to maintain the necessary separation between the world of the living and the world of the shades. It was a stern, solemn, and often rather depressing responsibility, but one he apparently undertook with unwavering diligence and a remarkable degree of impartiality. You just know Hades was probably secretly hoping for something a bit sunnier, a bit more lively when those cosmic lots were being drawn. Please let it be the nice, warm, sunny Mediterranean islands with all the excellent vineyards. Please let it be the islands. Nope, it's the infinite, soul-crushing, and distinctly unfestive darkness of the Underworld. Again, just my luck. He probably had a divine worst cosmic lottery draw ever commemorative t-shirt made, which he wore with quiet, stoic resignation in the privacy of his obsidian palace. His famous helm of darkness, that cap of invisibility gifted by the Cyclopes, also became a potent symbol of his new domain. It allowed him to move unseen, fitting for the ruler of the hidden world, the lord of all that is concealed beneath the earth. While he used it to great effect in the war against the Titans, it also in a way underscored his own somewhat shadowy, often invisible presence in the affairs of the upper world. He was a god who preferred to remain unseen, ruling his own vast silent kingdom with a firm, if rarely overtly cruel hand. The extent to which the ancient Greek myth of the division of the cosmos by lot aptai among the three great brother gods reflects much earlier, perhaps even pre-Greek or common Indo-European cosmological concepts of a fundamental tripartite universal structure, often sky-earth/sea and underworld, versus being a specifically Greek narrative innovation designed to logically explain the established domains, relative power structures, and distinct personalities of Zeus Poseidon. And Hades within their Olympian mythological system is a fascinating topic frequently explored by comparative mythologists and scholars of ancient Greek religious origins. So Hades became king of the underworld, not through malice or ambition, but through fate and the impartial drawing of lots. This reluctant aspect of his kingship is key to understanding why, despite the fear his realm inspired, Hades himself was often seen less as a source of active evil and more as a stern, just, and dutiful administrator of life's ultimate inevitable destination. The cosmic dice have been rolled. Egeria, the lots have been drawn amongst the victorious Olympian brothers, and your divine protagonist for this sleepy tale, Hades, has found himself the somewhat reluctant, if undeniably sovereign, king of the underworld. You've pictured his vast shadowy domain, a realm of flitting shades, mythical rivers, and distinct regions for the ordinary, the heroic, and the eternally damned. It's a kingdom he didn't actively choose, but one he rules with a stern, impartial, and largely unseen hand. This unseen nature, this aloofness from the sunlit world of the living, and the often rather boisterous social life of Mount Olympus contributed significantly to the awe, and indeed the fear, with which mortals regarded him. And this very fear is reflected in one of the most curious aspects of his cult. The many names and euphemistic epithets the ancient Greeks used when referring to him, some of which hint at surprisingly less terrifying, even potentially friendly or beneficial aspects of his complex divine persona. In ancient Greece, Egeria names and words were believed to hold inherent power. To speak a deity's true or primary name was often seen as a potent act, a direct invocation that could draw their attention. An attention that in the case of a powerful and somewhat gloomy chthonic god like Hades, you might not always want to attract too directly or too casually. It's like accidentally CCing the CEO of the entire Underworld on a rather trivial inner office memo about the consistently poor quality of the ambrosia in the Olympian break room. Probably best to avoid that if you can. Thus, the Greeks, with their characteristic blend of piety and pragmatic caution, often employed euphemisms, mild or indirect or more auspicious-sounding titles, when speaking of deities whose power was particularly feared, or whose nature was associated with life's more somber realities like death, disease, or divine retribution. The Greeks had so many polite, almost nervously deferential nicknames for Hades: the Rich One, the Famous One, the Receiver of Many Guests, Mr. Unseen Downstairs, who preferably stays downstairs. It's like they were trying really hard not to accidentally summon him by blurting out his actual, more formidable name too loudly at a dinner party just in case he was having a particularly bad millennium and decided to take it out on their olive harvest or their prize-winning goat. Very sensible, really, from a let's not unnecessarily poke the slumbering chthonic bear perspective. Hades' primary, most ancient personal name was often considered to be Idoneus Aidonevs, which, as we've touched upon, likely means the unseen one, or the invisible. This perfectly encapsulates his domain, the hidden subterranean realm of the dead, and his own nature often shrouded in darkness and mystery, perhaps even literally invisible thanks to that magical helm of darkness, his unique divine attribute. The very name Hades Hades, which also became synonymous with his kingdom, carries similar connotations of the unseen, or the place that unsees, i.e., makes things invisible. This inherent invisibility, this association with darkness and concealment, naturally contributed to the aura of fear and otherworldliness surrounding him. But it is in his euphemistic epithets that we begin to glimpse those surprisingly friendly, or at least less overtly terrifying aspects of his divine portfolio. A mainstream historical fact is that ancient Greeks frequently referred to Hades by a variety of descriptive and often deliberately euphemistic epithets, rather than using his more direct names, Idoneus or Hades, largely due to a superstitious awe and a reluctance to directly invoke the god most closely associated with death. By far the most common and significant of these euphemisms, one that eventually became almost a preferred alternative name for him, especially in cultic contexts or when wishing to emphasize a more positive aspect, was Pluton, which translates as the Rich One, the Giver of Wealth, or the Lord of Riches. This name, which gives us the Roman equivalent Pluto, highlights a completely different facet of his domain. Where does this wealth come from? Firstly, from the literal mineral riches contained deep within the earth, the gold, the silver, the precious gems and metals that were mined from his subterranean kingdom. Secondly, and perhaps even more importantly for an agrarian society, Pluton was associated with the agricultural wealth that springs forth from the earth. Seeds germinate in the darkness. Underground plants draw their nourishment from the soil and the cycle of growth. Death and regeneration, so crucial for life, was intimately connected to the chthonic realm over which Hades presided. His marriage to Persephone, the daughter of the grain goddess Demeter, who spent part of her year in the underworld and part in the world above, further cemented this connection to the earth's fertility and the seasonal cycle of agricultural bounty. So by calling him Pluton, the Greeks were not just trying to avoid saying the scary death god name, they were actively invoking his more benevolent wealth-bestowing aspect, focusing on him as a source of the hidden treasures and life-sustaining fertility that originated from beneath the Earth's surface. See, Egeria Hades wasn't all doom-gloom and eternal shadowy despair. He was also in his Pluton persona in charge of all the really shiny, valuable things hidden underground. Gold, silver, probably some incredibly interesting and highly valuable radioactive isotopes. It's just that fully appreciating and accessing this particular form of subterranean wealth often involved the minor, if rather significant inconvenience of, being deceased first. Details, but definitely a more friendly aspect to consider. Another common epithet was Climenus Klimenos, often translated as the renowned, the illustrious, or sometimes with a slightly more ambiguous or even ominous connotation, the notorious. This title acknowledges his immense power and the undeniable significance of his realm without necessarily specifying whether that fame is for good or ill. It's a respectful, if somewhat neutral, acknowledgement of his divine status. Then there was Jubileus Evulibs, meaning of good counsel, or the well-advised. This is a particularly intriguing epithet suggesting that Hades, despite his grim domain, was believed to possess a certain profound, perhaps rather somber wisdom, or that he could, through oracles of the dead or other chthonic means, offer sound, if perhaps unwelcome counsel to mortals. It hints at his role not just as a jailer of souls, but as a keeper of deep hidden knowledge, perhaps even a just arbiter in matters concerning the dead or the fulfillment of fate. Another descriptive title was Polydegmon, meaning the receiver of many, or he who is host to many. This epithet, much like Pluton, emphasizes a more neutral, inevitable aspect of his role. It highlights his impartiality. His kingdom is the one destination to which all mortals, regardless of their status, wealth, or virtue in life, must eventually journey. He is the ultimate all-encompassing host, receiving every soul into his vast, shadowy embrace. Not necessarily friendly in a warm, welcoming, come on in the ambrosia's lovely kind of way, but certainly impartial and non-discriminatory. Sometimes he was even referred to as Zeus Catachthonios, Zeus of the Underworld, which explicitly linked him to the supreme authority of his brother Zeus, but acknowledged his parallel sovereignty within the chthonic realm. This gave him a kind of reflected majesty, framing him as a legitimate and powerful king in his own right, not just some minor, malevolent underworld demon. The precise historical evolution and the relative popularity and regional variations in the usage of Hades' diverse array of epithets, particularly the noticeable and significant semantic shift towards the more generally benevolent and wealth-associated name Pluton in later classical and Hellenistic periods, is a fascinating area of study, with scholars of Greek religion and linguistics continuing to explore whether this reflects a genuine, widespread change in popular perception of the god over many centuries, perhaps a deliberate theological effort to soften his image, or simply the differing context of cultic worship, poetic invocation, and everyday euphemistic address. Why this intense focus on euphemisms? Egeria. It wasn't just about politeness. As we mentioned, there was a deep-seated belief in the power of names, a form of apotropaic magic. To speak the true or more fearsome name of such a powerful chthonic deity was thought to risk drawing his direct and potentially unwelcome or harmful attention to oneself. By using a more auspicious or neutral epithet, one could refer to the god or even invoke a specific, more positive aspect of his power, like Pluton's wealth-giving, without necessarily inviting the full, unmitigated force of his association with death and the gloomy underworld. It was a way of navigating a spiritually charged universe with caution and respect. If Hades decided to have a modern PR team to rebrand his image Egeria, they would undoubtedly lean very heavily into the whole Pluton, giver of all subterranean riches and ensuring fair distribution of eternal real estate angle. Hades, he's not just about eternal shadowy gloom and slightly depressing asphodel meadows anymore. Now, also featuring surprisingly good mineral deposits, excellent long-term investment opportunities in subterranean property, and a remarkably consistent track record in soul administration terms and conditions, and a prior state of being deceased may apply to fully appreciate all benefits and amenities. These many names, these carefully chosen epithets, reveal a god far more complex than the one-dimensional villain of modern caricature. They show us a Hades who was not only the unseen lord of the dead, but also the rich one, from whose realm came the earth's bounty, the renowned king of a vast domain, and even perhaps the well-advised, keeper of profound if somber wisdom. The Greeks, it seems, understood that even the god of death had more than one face, more than one name, and perhaps a surprisingly friendly side if you knew how to address him correctly. You've now learned Egeria, how Hades, the unseen one, became the somewhat reluctant sovereign of the vast shadowy realm beneath the earth, not through ambition or conquest, but through the impartial, if perhaps slightly unfortunate for him, drawing of cosmic lots after the great Titanomachy. You've also discovered that the ancient Greeks, with their characteristic blend of awe and pragmatic caution, often preferred to address him by a host of euphemistic epithets: Pluton the Rich One, Clymenus the Renowned, Eubuleus of Good Counsel, Polydegmon, Receiver of Many. Names that hint at aspects of his divine persona far more complex and considerably less terrifying than the one-dimensional villain he's often made out to be in modern pop culture. But beyond his name and the way he acquired his kingdom, what was Hades actually like as a ruler? Was he a cruel tyrant delighting in the suffering of the shades? Or was there perhaps a different kind of order, a stern but ultimately fair administration in his dark domain? This Egeria is where we begin to see the surprisingly friendly, or at least surprisingly just and not actively malevolent, side of the Lord of the Dead. A mainstream historical fact is that in ancient Greek mythology, Hades was generally depicted not as an instigator of evil or a capricious tormentor of souls, but as a just, if undeniably stern and unyielding ruler of the underworld. His primary divine responsibility was to maintain the natural order by ensuring that the dead remained dead, that they stayed within the clearly defined boundaries of his realm, and that the intricate laws governing the passage of souls were meticulously upheld. He was in essence the ultimate incorruptible cosmic administrator, the divine CEO of a very large, very quiet, and exceptionally well-regulated subterranean organization. Hades' official job description, if it were posted on some celestial notice board, might read something like this: position vacant, not really. It's a lifetime appointment, ruler of the underworld. Key responsibilities include ensuring all deceased persons remain deceased and do not attempt unauthorized return excursions to the sunlit world, managing a large and generally quite listless ghostly population with quiet efficiency, keeping the three-headed office security dog Cerberus adequately well-fed on shades who foolishly try to escape, probably, and perhaps the occasional heroic visitor who forgets to bring a soothing honey cake, and rigorously maintaining a strict no unauthorized resurrections by appointment only, and all resurrection paperwork must be filed in triplicate with the Fates policy. Ideal candidate must be comfortable with eternal gloom, a distinct lack of natural sunlight, and a working environment largely populated by silent flitting shades. Benefits package includes immortality, a very cool helm of invisibility, a surprisingly stable if somewhat gloomy real estate portfolio, and the distinct advantage of never having to attend those terribly noisy and often rather drama-filled Olympian parties up on Mount Olympus unless absolutely positively unavoidable. One of Hades' most crucial functions was simply keeping the dead in the underworld. That's why Cerberus, his monstrous three-headed hound, guarded the gates with such vigilance, not so much to prevent the living from entering, though that was also part of his job, and he was very good at it, but primarily to stop any of the resident shades from getting any bright ideas about staging a mass breakout and returning to the land of the living to haunt their annoying relatives, or finish that particularly interesting game of knucklebones they were in the middle of when Thanatos Death himself came calling. Hades was all about maintaining those boundaries. He also ensured a certain order among the vast silent throngs of shades in the Asphodel Meadows. Though given their generally listless and memory-impaired state, they probably weren't causing too many major disciplinary infractions. Importantly, Hades was not usually depicted as personally inflicting punishment on the souls in his realm, at least not on the ordinary ones. The truly spectacularly wicked individuals, those who had committed heinous crimes against gods or mortals like Tantalus Sisyphus or Ixion, were confined to the deepest, darkest abyss of Tartarus where they endured eternal divinely decreed torments. But these torments were often overseen by other chthonic entities, such as the Erinyes, the Furies, those ancient snake-haired goddesses of vengeance who pursued and punished wrongdoers, particularly those guilty of crimes against kin. Hades presided over this system of divine justice, ensuring that the sentences handed down by the gods or the fates were carried out. But he wasn't typically shown down there with a pitchfork, gleefully stoking the fires of Tartarus. or personally devising new and inventive eternal punishments for minor transgressions. That wasn't his skill. He was more of a stern, aloof chairman of the board than a hands-on, micromanaging middle manager of eternal suffering. His most defining characteristics as a ruler were his sternness and his unyielding, implacable nature. Once a soul had entered his domain, there was generally no appeal, no parole, no early release for good behavior. His decisions were final. He was not easily swayed by prayers, tears, or sacrifices. At least not when it came to the fundamental law of death: mortals die and they stay dead. This made him deeply feared, of course, because he represented the inevitability and irreversibility of death. But it also, in a strange way, made him predictable and just within the often capricious and emotionally volatile world of the Greek gods. Hades was like the ultimate impartial cosmic bureaucrat. Name: Idoneus. Cause of death: universal human condition eventually. Okay, please fill out these ethereal intake forms in triplicate. Try to keep the ectoplasm neat. Next: no, sorry, mister. Mighty king of everything, upstairs who used to be my brother. Your recently acquired royal status unfortunately does not grant you a fast pass through the Asphodel Meadows or an automatic upgrade to an Elysian Fields timeshare. Everyone waits their turn for eternal, undifferentiated mediocrity. Here, unless your paperwork clearly indicates you were a divinely sanctioned hero. In which case, Elysium is that way, third door on the left past the River Leith. Or if you were truly spectacularly awful in life, then Tartarus is straight down that rather ominous smoky corridor. Rules are rules, you see. Non-negotiable. The extent to which the ancient Greek concept of justice within Hades' realm, particularly the post-mortem judgment, and the differential assignment of souls to either the blissful Elysian Fields, the neutral Asphodel Meadows, or the punitive depths of Tartarus by the legendary judges of the dead, Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Aeacus, reflects much earlier Mycenaean or even Minoan Bronze Age afterlife beliefs, versus being a later, more sophisticated philosophical or ethical development within classical Greek thought, perhaps most famously articulated in the eschatological myths found in Plato's dialogues, is a complex and fascinating issue that scholars of ancient Greek religion and philosophy continue to explore through comparative mythology, funerary archaeology, and the careful evolution of textual sources. Hades, as king, presided over this entire system, ensuring that souls were, at least in theory, directed to their appropriate and deserved afterlife destination. Perhaps one of the most surprisingly friendly aspects of Hades, when compared to his Olympian brothers Zeus and Poseidon, was his relative lack of capricious cruelty or direct malicious interference in the lives of mortals before their time came. Zeus, as we know, was notorious for his endless amorous affairs, which often brought great suffering to the mortal women he pursued, and their families, and his divine temper tantrums could unleash devastating storms or punishments. Poseidon, too, was known for his grudges and his ability to stir up terrifying sea storms or earthquakes when displeased. Hades, by contrast, is rarely depicted in the myths as being arbitrarily cruel or as actively seeking to cause harm to the living out of spite, jealousy, or for his own personal amusement. His actions, when they did impact the mortal world, were almost always directly related to his solemn duties as ruler of the dead, upholding the laws of his realm or occasionally, as we shall see, acquiring a queen. He was in his own way a remarkably stable and predictable deity, so Hades wasn't exactly Mr. Sunshine and spontaneous rainbows. But on the other hand, he also wasn't generally out there actively trying to ruin your entire city with a sudden, unprovoked plague, or attempting to turn you into a particularly unattractive species of shrubbery just for kicks, unlike some of his more, shall we say, dramatically inclined and interventionist Olympian relatives. He was much more of a quiet, generally keeps to himself, just wants everyone to follow the clearly posted Underworld HOA guidelines and not track ectoplasm on the obsidian floors kind of deity. Surprisingly chill, really, for a god whose primary associates were gloom, despair, and a very large three-headed dog with a penchant for unwelcome visitors. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit, and one that further underscores his rather un-Olympian sense of domestic stability, is that Hades was one of the very few major Greek gods who was almost universally considered to be remarkably faithful to his wife Persephone after their admittedly rather controversial marriage, which we'll get to. Unlike his brothers Zeus and Poseidon, whose extramarital, divine, and mortal liaisons are the stuff of endless mythological legend, and considerable Olympian soap opera, Hades is very rarely, if ever, depicted as having wandering eyes or engaging in amorous escapades outside his marriage. This suggests a certain steadfastness, a kind of orderly devotion, even in his personal divine life, which is rather refreshing if still a bit gloomy. His realm was one of order, and it seems his household in this respect at least reflected that. You have now, Egeria, become acquainted with Hades, not just as the unseen one who rules the vast shadowy domain of the dead, but also as Pluton, the rich one, the giver of subterranean wealth, and as a stern, unyielding, yet largely impartial administrator of cosmic law. You understand that his fearsome reputation often stemmed more from humanity's natural dread of death itself and the gloomy nature of his realm, rather than from any inherent active malice or capricious cruelty on his part, especially when compared to some of his more, shall we say, dramatically interventionist Olympian siblings. He mostly kept to himself, diligently managing the ever-increasing population of shades. But even a god of the underworld surrounded by eternal twilight and the silent flitting of ghosts might eventually yearn for a bit of companionship. A queen to share his obsidian throne and perhaps help with the rather extensive administrative duties of ruling all of departed humanity. And this Egeria brings us to one of the most famous, most poignant, and most complex myths associated with Hades. His rather abrupt and decidedly unconventional acquisition of a bride, the beautiful goddess Persephone. The story of Hades and Persephone is central to understanding both their characters and some fundamental aspects of Greek religious thought, particularly concerning the cycle of seasons and the mysteries of life, death, and rebirth. A mainstream historical fact is that this myth most famously recounted in the ancient Homeric hymn to Demeter, though alluded to in many other sources, formed the sacred core of the Eleusinian Mysteries, one of the most ancient, revered, and secretive religious cults in all of ancient Greece, promising its initiates a blessed afterlife. Persephone, also known by her earlier name Kore, meaning simply the maiden, was the lovely young daughter of Zeus, king of the gods, and Demeter, the powerful goddess of agriculture, grain, and the fertile earth. Persephone herself was a goddess of springtime flowers, youth, and burgeoning life. A radiant figure, seemingly the very antithesis of Hades and his gloomy subterranean domain. Imagine her Egeria, a vision of light and innocence, perhaps wandering through a lush, sun-drenched meadow, gathering wildflowers, poppies, narcissus, hyacinths, with her attendant nymphs, the very air around her alive with the scent of blossoms and the hum of bees. It is in such a scene of idyllic beauty that Hades, lord of the underworld, first beholds her. And in a manner quite typical of the often rather direct, and from a modern perspective, deeply problematic romantic approaches of some Greek gods, he decides he wants her for his queen. Hades, it seems, wasn't particularly skilled in the art of subtle courtship, witty drawing room banter, or the patient wooing of a maiden's affections with gifts of poetry and song. His preferred method for acquiring a queen was apparently somewhat more along the lines of a surprise, high-speed subterranean chariot ride directly to your new, slightly gloomy, and entirely non-negotiable forever home. Not exactly a rom-com meet-cute Egeria, but definitely memorable and certainly a very effective way to avoid any awkward small talk about the weather or your respective opinions on the latest philosophical trends. According to the myth, Hades, with the often depicted as rather reluctant or at least tacit and perhaps slightly guilty conscience permission of his brother, Zeus suddenly causes the earth to yawn open beneath Persephone's feet. From this gaping chasm he emerges in his dark horse-drawn chariot, seizes the terrified, shrieking maiden and carries her off down, down, down into the shadowy depths of his underworld kingdom to be his bride and queen. Her cries for help echo across the meadow, heard only by a few minor deities like Hecate, goddess of witchcraft and crossroads, and Helios, the all-seeing sun god. Her mother Demeter, upon discovering her beloved daughter's disappearance, is quite understandably utterly distraught. She searches the earth relentlessly, her grief and rage growing with each fruitless day. In her sorrow, she neglects her divine duties as goddess of the harvest. The crops fail, the earth becomes barren, famine stalks the land, and humanity faces starvation. This, of course, gets Zeus's attention. The king of the gods, realizing that if all mortals perish, there will be no one left to offer sacrifices to Olympus, finally intervenes. He sends Hermes, the divine messenger, down to the underworld to command Hades to release Persephone and allow her to return to her grieving mother. Hades as a ruler who generally respects the cosmic order and the authority of his elder brother Zeus agrees to let Persephone go. But here comes the crucial and rather cunning twist in the tale. Before Persephone leaves his realm, Hades, with a display of what might be interpreted as either thoughtful hospitality or subtle binding magic, offers her some food. Specifically, a few glistening ruby-red pomegranate seeds. Persephone, perhaps out of hunger after her time in the underworld, or perhaps simply unaware of the profound implications, eats them. That pomegranate Egeria, it's the ultimate ancient Greek contractual snack, the original read the fine print before you consume comestible. Oh, just a few of these absolutely delicious jewel-like pomegranate seeds, my dearest Persephone. Hades might have murmured with an air of feigned innocence. A little something to sustain you on your long journey back to the sunlit world. No hidden clauses, no unbreakable ancient vows, no eternal commitments to periodically co-ruling a vast and somewhat shadowy subterranean kingdom involved whatsoever. I absolutely promise divine fingers crossed firmly behind my back, which of course you can't actually see because it's rather artistically gloomy down here in my palace. The consequence of eating the food of the dead, even a few pomegranate seeds, is that Persephone is now irrevocably bound to the underworld for at least a portion of each year. And so a compromise is reached. Brokered by Zeus, Persephone will spend a certain period typically described as 1/3 or sometimes 1/2 of the year representing the barren winter months, when seeds lie dormant beneath the earth, with her husband Hades as queen of the underworld. For the remainder of the year, she will return to the world above to be with her mother, Demeter, bringing with her the joy of springtime, the blossoming of flowers, and the renewal of life. Thus, the myth beautifully explains the cycle of the seasons, the annual death and rebirth of vegetation. The interpretation of Persephone's precise role and emotional state in her rather unconventional marriage to Hades, whether she ultimately remains an eternal, unwilling victim of a brutal abduction, or if she gradually reconciles to her fate and perhaps even embraces her considerable power and status as the revered, if somewhat feared, queen of the underworld, or even if, over the long eons, a complex form of affection, mutual respect, or a stable partnership develops between her and her shadowy king, varies significantly across different ancient textual sources. Artistic depictions and modern scholarly perspectives, reflecting the myth's rich psychological ambiguity and its capacity to embody diverse understandings of marriage power and the cyclical nature of existence. So where does this leave our assessment of Hades as surprisingly friendly? The act of abduction itself, by any modern standard, is undeniably violent and non-consensual, and certainly doesn't paint Hades in a particularly warm or fuzzy light. However, within the often brutal and morally ambiguous framework of Greek mythology, certain nuances might be considered. Firstly, he did, according to most versions, seek Zeus's permission, however grudgingly given. In a world where the king of the gods himself was hardly a paragon of consensual romantic relationships, this might have lent a veneer of divine legitimacy to the act, at least from an Olympian perspective. Secondly, once Persephone is in his realm, Hades is not generally depicted as mistreating her. She becomes his honored queen, sharing his throne and his authority over the dead. There are no tales of him being unfaithful to her, which, as we noted, makes him almost unique among the major Greek gods. Their marriage, once established through this rather dramatic initial acquisition, is usually portrayed as remarkably stable, a kind of somber, enduring partnership. This steadfastness, this lack of capricious infidelity, could be seen as a peculiar form of divine reliability, if not exactly warm, fuzzy friendliness. And his eventual willingness to compromise to allow Persephone to return to the upper world for a significant portion of the year shows a degree of flexibility and perhaps even a grudging acknowledgement of Demeter's power and Persephone's own needs, which is more than some other more tyrannical divine figures might have conceded. So, the divine timeshare agreement for a goddess was brokered probably after much celestial legal wrangling, and some very complicated negotiations involving Zeus, Demeter, and Hades, with Hermes running frantic messages back and forth between Olympus and the underworld. Okay, Persephone, my dear niece, daughter, wife, divine family trees can get so complicated. Just to confirm, is it your designated May to August slot in the underworld this year? Or are you still officially on your bringing springtime joy and an abundance of blooming daffodils to deserving mortals shift up above? We really need to get this celestial calendaring sorted out once and for all. The myth of Hades and Persephone, therefore, while beginning with an act of force, evolves into a more complex story about the interconnectedness of life and death, the sorrow of loss, the power of maternal love, and the establishment of a unique, if seasonally divided, divine marriage that ultimately underpins the very rhythms of the natural world. It adds another layer to our understanding of Hades, not just the stern keeper of souls, but also a king, who in his own rather gloomy and unconventional way sought and secured a queen for his shadowy realm. The dramatic earth-shattering, quite literally, abduction of Persephone Egeria, her unwilling journey to the underworld. Demeter's devastating grief that plunged the world into barren winter, and Zeus's eventual somewhat flustered divine intervention leading to that famous pomegranate seed-based timeshare agreement. This entire epic saga has now unfolded in your sleepy contemplation. You understand how Persephone, the radiant maiden of flowers and springtime, became for at least a portion of each year the reluctant, or perhaps eventually not so reluctant, queen of the dead, sharing a shadowy throne with her formidable, if often misunderstood husband Hades. But what was this divine co-rulership actually like? How did this unlikely pair, the vibrant goddess of new life and the somber king of departed souls, govern their vast gloomy domain? Let us now peer into the presumed dynamics of their shadowed thrones and their powerful, if decidedly unconventional, partnership. A mainstream historical fact is that in ancient Greek mythology and religious belief, Persephone, after her controversial marriage to Hades, was indeed recognized and revered as the powerful queen of the underworld, ruling alongside her husband. She wasn't just a decorative consort or a perpetual pining captive. She wielded genuine authority in his realm, often described with epithets like Dread Persephone or the Pure One, indicating her own formidable divine status and her integral role in the governance of the dead. Her presence added a crucial female dimension to the otherwise starkly masculine authority of Hades, and together they formed a stable, if somewhat somber, ruling dyad at the heart of the chthonic kingdom. Their palace in the underworld, one imagines Egeria, probably wasn't big on cheerful sunlit breakfast nooks with jaunty floral curtains. More likely it was a grand, imposing edifice of obsidian, or some other dark, gleaming stone, its vast halls filled with echoing silence, flickering torchlight, and perhaps the distant, mournful sound of the river Styx. Here on their shadowed thrones, Hades and Persephone would receive the endless procession of newly arrived shades, oversee the judgments of Minos Rhadamanthus and Iacchus, and generally ensure the smooth, orderly administration of their vast subterranean domain. It was probably the ultimate in quiet luxury home decor, with a strong emphasis on eternal and slightly unsettling. How did they co-rule? While Hades remained the ultimate sovereign, the unyielding enforcer of the laws of death and the boundaries of his kingdom, Persephone's role was often seen as complementary and sometimes subtly influential. The precise balance of power and the exact nature of the emotional and ruling relationship between Hades and Persephone as co-sovereigns of the underworld, whether their union eventually evolved into a form of genuine, if perhaps somewhat melancholic partnership based on mutual respect and shared duty, or if it remained primarily one of resigned acceptance and carefully negotiated spheres of influence on Persephone's part, or if she, in fact, wielded a distinct and sometimes even more feared form of authority over specific aspects of the afterlife or certain types of souls, are complex questions that continue to be explored by classicists and mythographers, often varying significantly across different ancient textual sources, regional cult practices, and diverse artistic representations from archaic to Roman times. In some traditions or artistic depictions, Persephone appears almost as formidable as unyielding as Hades himself, a true dread queen whose pronouncements are to be feared. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that in some specific local cults or more esoteric belief systems, Persephone was sometimes even seen as being more terrifying, or more directly involved in the judgment or fate of certain souls than her famously aloof husband. Perhaps her experience of both the sunlit world of life and the shadowy realm of death gave her a unique and sometimes rather chilling perspective on mortal frailties and divine justice. She wasn't just Mrs. Hades passively arranging the spectral flowers in the underworld palace. She was the queen of the dead in her own right, a powerful chthonic deity whose authority was to be respected. If Hades was the stern, implacable CEO of Afterlife Inc., then Persephone was undoubtedly the highly effective and possibly even more intimidating chief operating officer, perhaps with a particularly keen understanding of spectral HR issues and the proper management of disgruntled, ghostly employees in the Asphodel Meadows. You did not want to get on her bad side, especially if you were a recently deceased shade hoping for a slightly less gloomy corner plot with a marginally better view of the River Lethe. Her dual nature as both Kor, the Maiden of Spring, and Persephone, the Queen of the Underworld, was central to her power, and her cult especially in the Eleusinian mysteries. This duality made her a potent symbol of the cyclical nature of life, death, and rebirth. When she was in the underworld with Hades, the earth above grew cold and barren. When she returned to her mother Demeter, she brought with her the warmth, the flowers, the new growth of spring and summer. This gave her a unique understanding, a foot in both realms that perhaps even Hades himself did not fully possess. She knew the joys of life and the sorrows of its absence. Within their shared domain, their court would include other significant chthonic deities and entities. Hecate, the mysterious goddess of witchcraft, crossroads, and ghosts often associated with Persephone, would be a powerful presence. Thanatos, death personified, and his twin brother Hypnos, sleep, would be carrying out their solemn duties. The three stern judges of the dead, Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Aeacus, would be meticulously weighing the lives of mortals and assigning them to their eternal destinations. And the dread Erinyes Furies, those ancient avengers of blood guilt, would ensure that the most heinous sinners received their due in the depths of Tartarus. Hades and Persephone presided over this entire complex and generally rather somber divine bureaucracy. Imagine Hades and Persephone having a particularly important royal council meeting in their obsidian throne room. Hades, in his deep, resonant voice, might declare, "My royal decree is that all newly arrived souls must henceforth present their ferryman's receipt from Charon in triplicate and ensure their obol payment is up to date to prevent any further unauthorized loitering on the wrong side of the Styx order must be maintained." Persephone, after a thoughtful pause, might then add with a gentle but firm inclination of her crowned head, "Yes, my dear husband, an excellent and entirely necessary point regarding administrative efficiency. But perhaps we could also consider offering a slightly nicer, more palatable variety of asphodel in the main meadows this season. And maybe investigate the possibility of a new, slightly less leaky and perhaps even moderately comfortable ferry for poor old Charon. One must also consider the morale and the general dampness levels of both our long-term residents and our hard-working staff, wouldn't you agree? It was a partnership of sorts. Even if one partner was a bit more focused on the gloom and the other on the occasional fleeting possibility of a slightly less gloomy flower. And what of the surprisingly friendly aspect of Hades in this marital context? As we've noted, one of the most remarkable things about Hades, especially when compared to his notoriously philandering brothers Zeus and Poseidon, is his apparent marital fidelity. Once Persephone becomes his queen, there are virtually no myths detailing Hades having extramarital affairs or siring illegitimate demigod children all over the mortal world. Their marriage, however traumatic its beginnings, is generally depicted as a stable, enduring, and exclusive union. This steadfastness, this lack of capricious romantic entanglement, while perhaps not friendly in a warm and cuddly sense, does present Hades as a reliable, if somewhat somber, divine partner. He wanted a queen. He got a queen, albeit through rather questionable means, and then he seems to have remained largely devoted to her and their shared rule. For Persephone, after the initial shock and sorrow, this might have eventually led to a degree of security and respect within her unwelcome domain, allowing her to truly grow into her powerful role as its formidable co-ruler. Theirs was a shadowed throne, certainly, but one they appear to have shared with a unique, if eternally complex, divine understanding. You are now, Egeria, beginning to appreciate the rather complex and surprisingly stable, if somewhat seasonally challenged, divine partnership between Hades, the stern king of the underworld, and his formidable queen Persephone. You've seen how her arrival, though initially traumatic, eventually led to her co-rulership of that vast shadowy domain, her own power and dread majesty, acknowledged by gods and mortals alike. Their shadowed thrones, side by side in their gloomy subterranean palace, represent a kind of enduring, if not exactly overtly joyful, divine order. But beyond the personal dynamics of this unique royal couple, What was Hades' fundamental role in relation to all the other souls? The countless throngs of ordinary mortals who, sooner or later, were destined to become permanent residents of his kingdom. Here at Egeria, we encounter another aspect of Hades that contributes to his surprisingly friendly, or perhaps more accurately, his surprisingly fair and entirely non-discriminatory reputation, his role as the inevitable host, the one who eventually welcomes every single mortal soul to his realm with a cool, impartial, and entirely unavoidable embrace. A mainstream historical fact, central to the ancient Greek understanding of the cosmos, is that Hades presided over a realm that was the ultimate, inescapable destination for all mortals after death. His kingdom was not a selective afterlife resort for only the very good or the very bad. It was the universal repository for every psyche, every breath soul, once it had departed the sunlit world of the living. Hades, in this sense, had the ultimate open-door policy for his kingdom. Rich man, poor man, beggar man. Thief, virtuous philosopher, celebrated poet. Conquering hero, humble farmer, revered priestess, forgotten slave. Yup, every single one of them was on his eternal guest list. No RSVPs were required at Egeria. Your eventual arrival was meticulously anticipated. And it must be said entirely non-negotiable. Crucially, Hades' primary role was to receive the dead, not to actively pursue them or to cause death itself. That latter, rather grim task usually fell to other personified forces, most notably Thanatos, death incarnate, a son of Nyx night, often depicted as a winged figure who would come to claim the dying. Or more fundamentally, a mortal's lifespan was determined by the Moirai, the three fates Clotho who spins the thread of life, Lachesis who measures it, and Atropos who inexorably cuts it. Hades wasn't out there in the upper world with a divine scythe, gleefully harvesting souls before their appointed time. Nor was he sending plagues or engineering unfortunate chariot accidents just to boost his kingdom's population figures. He generally waited with immense stony patience for Hermes Psychopompos to escort the newly departed shades down to Charon's ferry. He was less a predator of souls and more the proprietor of the ultimate all-inclusive, exceptionally long-stay subterranean hotel, from which it must be noted that there were absolutely no early checkouts and the room service was rumored to be rather lacking in variety. This role as the universal receiver imbued Hades with a profound impartiality. Unlike his Olympian siblings who frequently played favorites among mortals, showering blessings upon their chosen heroes or inflicting terrible punishments upon those who displeased them, often based on personal whims, family connections, or complex divine rivalries, Hades in his reception of the dead was remarkably even-handed. He didn't discriminate at the gates of the Underworld, provided, of course, that your relatives had thoughtfully remembered to place that essential obol in your mouth for Charon's fare. Even divine impartiality had its small administrative fees. Your social status in the world above your wealth, your beauty, your heroic deeds, or your utter obscurity. None of these typically granted you any special privileges or exemptions from entering his realm once your thread of life was cut. Death as administered by Hades was the great ultimate leveler. The extent to which the ancient Greek portrayal of Hades as an impartial, almost dispassionate, and strictly rule-bound host to all deceased souls reflects a genuine, deeply held Greek theological attempt to depersonalize or rationalize the profound and universal fear of death itself, thereby making its inevitability slightly more palatable, versus it being primarily a sophisticated narrative strategy to distinguish his specific chthonic function and relatively non-interventionist character from the often far more active, emotionally volatile, and ethically ambiguous interventions of the Olympian gods in the day-to-day affairs of human life, is a fascinating topic frequently explored by scholars of Greek religion, mythology, and eschatology. Once within his realm, the laws of the underworld such as they were applied equally to all shades. The judgment of souls by the three revered judges, Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Aeacus themselves, once mortal kings renowned for their justice, was at least in its idealized form based on one's deeds in life, not on one's earthly rank or wealth. This system over which Hades and Persephone presided aimed for a kind of post-mortem cosmic justice, assigning souls to their appropriate eternal destinations, the dreary but neutral asphodel meadows for the unremarkable majority, the blissful Elysian fields for the exceptionally virtuous and heroic, or the terrible depths of Tartarus for the truly unforgivably wicked. Hades himself wasn't personally conducting the individual soul audits or deciding who went where. He was the monarch who ensured that this divinely ordained system of judgment and allocation functioned smoothly and without corruption. This inherent fairness and lack of capricious cruelty is another key aspect that contributes to the surprisingly friendly, or at least surprisingly not actively hostile, perception of Hades. He is rarely, if ever, depicted in the myths as torturing souls for his own amusement, or as acting out of personal spite or jealousy towards mortals in the way Zeus or Poseidon so often did. His actions are almost invariably tied to his defined role and the unyielding laws of his kingdom. He is stern, he is unmovable. His name was sometimes associated with Aegean, not to see, but also perhaps with a Melikos, unpitying or implacable, but he is not generally portrayed as actively personally malevolent. He wasn't exactly Mr. Sunshine and Rainbows, the life and soul of the divine party. But he also wasn't out there actively trying to ruin your day with unexpected lightning bolts, unprovoked sea storms, or by turning you into a particularly unattractive species of arachnid, just because you happen to be slightly too good at weaving for his divine taste, unlike some of his more, shall we say, dramatically inclined and creatively punitive Olympian relatives. Hades was much more of a quiet, generally keeps to himself. Just wants everyone to follow the clearly posted Underworld health and safety guideline. Rule number 1. Please ensure you are in fact actually deceased before attempting entry. Rule number 2. No unauthorized exits, ever. Kind of deity. Surprisingly chill, really, for a god whose entire professional existence revolved around death gloom. And a very large three-headed and presumably quite slobbery guard dog. A quirky or fringe tidbit is the ancient Greek saying, "No one escapes Hades," which, while sounding rather ominous, wasn't necessarily meant as a direct threat from the god himself, but more as a simple matter-of-fact statement about the absolute universality and inevitability of death for all mortals. Hades wasn't actively trying to catch you. He knew you were coming eventually. He could afford to be patient. In fact, there are very few, if any, myths of Hades attempting to actively lure or trick living people into his realm prematurely. He generally waited with impeccable divine decorum for them to arrive via the proper officially sanctioned channels, i.e., after they had quite definitively shuffled off their mortal coil. His kingdom then, while undeniably a place of sorrow for those who mourned the departed and a realm of eternal shadow for its inhabitants, was also in its own way a realm of profound order and absolute impartiality. Hades, the inevitable host, welcomed all with the same stern, unyielding, but ultimately fair embrace, ensuring that the great cycle of life and death continued according to the ancient, unbreakable laws of the cosmos. This steadfast, rule-bound nature, this lack of divine caprice in his dealings with the dead, is perhaps one of the most surprisingly friendly, or at least respectably reliable aspects of this often misunderstood god. You are now, Egeria, beginning to appreciate the rather unique and surprisingly orderly administrative style of Hades, the stern but largely impartial king of the Underworld. You've seen how his realm, though undeniably gloomy, functioned, with a certain inexorable rule-bound consistency, welcoming all mortal souls with an almost bureaucratic even-handedness and ensuring that the fundamental laws of life and death were meticulously upheld. He wasn't out there actively causing trouble for mortals, unlike some of his more flamboyant Olympian relatives. He was primarily concerned with the smooth, efficient, and entirely leak-proof management of his vast subterranean domain. But our sleepy exploration into why Hades might be considered surprisingly friendly, or at least significantly less villainous than his modern reputation suggests, would be woefully incomplete if we didn't delve into another even more positive and life-affirming aspect of his divine portfolio. His identity as Pluton the Rich One, the generous bestower of the Earth's hidden wealth, and through his connection with Persephone, a crucial, if often overlooked, player in the cycle of agricultural bounty. A mainstream historical fact, and one that significantly nuances our understanding of this chthonic deity, is that in ancient Greek religion and cult, Hades was very frequently and often preferably worshipped and referred to by the euphemistic epithet Pluton. This name derived from the Greek word plautos, meaning wealth, or riches, deliberately shifts the focus away from his more somber role as Lord of the Dead and instead highlights his dominion over the vast unseen treasures contained within the earth. When the ancient Greeks wished to appease this powerful god, or to seek blessings related to the earth's bounty, it was often Pluton, the giver of wealth, they addressed, rather than the more fearsome Idoneus, the unseen one. If Hades had a modern-day, slightly stressed public relations team in Egeria, they would undoubtedly have pushed the Pluton branding with absolute unwavering enthusiasm. Forget all that depressing king of eternal gloom and despair stuff, they'd advise him. It's just not resonating with the current mortal demographic. We need to rebrand. From now on, you are Pluton, not just your afterlife administrator anymore. Now, also featuring exclusive access to premium subterranean riches, surprisingly good mineral deposits, and a seasonal partnership with the goddess of springtime. Terms and conditions apply. Applicants must generally be deceased to fully appreciate all benefits, but agricultural blessings are available for pre-booking by the living. Offer void where prohibited by excessively cheerful Olympian deities. Where did this wealth of Pluton originate? Firstly and most obviously, it referred to the literal mineral wealth hidden deep within his subterranean kingdom. All the precious metals, the gleaming gold, the shining silver, the useful copper and tin, and all the beautiful gemstones that mortals prize so highly were understood to originate from the depths of the earth, from Pluton's domain. He was in this sense the divine guardian or ultimate source of these hidden treasures. Miners toiling in the Laurian silver mines near Athens, or prospectors searching for gold in the mountains of Thrace might offer a prayer to Pluton for a rich vein for a lucky strike. So Hades isn't just diligently managing an infinite and ever-increasing number of rather listless, ghostly tenants in his vast underworld timeshare complex. He's also the incredibly wealthy, if somewhat reclusive divine CEO of Subterranean Riches, Minerals, and Assorted Valuable Underground Stuff Incorporated. Gold, silver, diamonds. If the Greeks had a particular fondness for them, that really useful vein of slightly radioactive but incredibly shiny unobtainium that everyone's always looking for in science fiction. It's all technically under his divine portfolio. He was basically the ancient world's gloomiest, but by far its wealthiest and most successful venture capitalist, with a portfolio almost entirely invested in below-ground assets. But Pluton's riches were not just confined to inert metals and stones. Even more vitally for an agrarian society like ancient Greece, he was also profoundly connected to agricultural bounty, to the very fertility of the earth that sustained human life. This might seem counterintuitive for a god of the dead, but the logic is beautifully cyclical. Seeds, as you know, Egeria must first be buried in the darkness of the earth, Pluton's realm, before they can germinate and sprout forth into the sunlit world as life-giving crops. The Underworld, therefore, was not just a tomb, it was also, in a very real sense, a womb, a place of hidden gestation and potential rebirth, at least for the plant kingdom. This connection to agricultural fertility was, of course, massively amplified and made explicit through Hades/Pluton's marriage to Persephone. As we've explored Persephone, the daughter of Demeter, the great Olympian goddess of grain, and the harvest was the very embodiment of springtime growth and burgeoning vegetation, her annual cyclical journey, spending one part of the year with her husband Pluton in the depths of the earth, corresponding to the barren winter months when seeds lie dormant, and the other part with her mother Demeter in the world above, bringing forth the blossoms of spring and the abundance of summer and autumn, directly linked Pluton to this fundamental rhythm of agricultural life. Through his queen, the Rich One became an indispensable partner in the great cosmic cycle of growth, death, and regeneration that ensured the nourishment of mortals. Ancient Greek farmers, when planting their precious barley or wheat, would offer prayers not just to Demeter and Persephone for a good harvest, but also quite likely to Pluton, the lord of the fertile darkness from which that harvest would ultimately spring. O mighty Pluton, esteemed giver of wealth from both above and below the earth, but mostly below, we understand. A hopeful farmer might intone, scattering his seeds, "Please ensure these humble kernels find favor in your rich, dark domain, that they may germinate with vigor, and that your lovely wife, Queen Persephone, brings them forth with abundance when she next graces our sunlit fields." And if, while you're at it, you could perhaps arrange for a small, previously undiscovered gold nugget to accidentally surface in my south field during the plowing season, that would also be most gratefully appreciated. No pressure, of course. Just a thought. The cults of Pluton, while perhaps less numerous and certainly less publicly ostentatious than those of the major Olympian deities, did exist. They often had a distinctly chthonic, earth-based character, with rituals perhaps performed at night, or involving offerings made into pits or fissures in the ground. These cults would focus on seeking his blessings for wealth, for mineral discoveries, or very commonly for agricultural fertility and an abundant harvest. The Eleusinian mysteries, that most famous and revered of all ancient Greek secret religious cults, centered on the myth of Demeter and Persephone and the cycle of life, death, and rebirth. While Hades/Pluton was not the primary focus of the public rituals at Eleusis, his role as Persephone's husband and as the ruler of the realm from which she periodically returned was absolutely integral to the entire sacred drama, and its promise of a blessed afterlife, a different kind of riches for its initiates. In artistic depictions, Pluton is often portrayed with attributes that clearly signify his connection to abundance and wealth, further distinguishing him from the purely grim image of Hades, Lord of Shades. He might be shown holding a cornucopia, the horn of plenty, overflowing with fruits, grains, and flowers, a potent symbol of inexhaustible nourishment and riches. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that this cornucopia, so frequently associated with Platon and other deities of earthly abundance like Demeter or Tyche. Fortune was itself mythologically said to be a horn of the goat Amalthea, the divine goat who suckled the infant Zeus on Crete. Breaking off her horn accidentally, one hopes in Zeus's playful exuberance it became magically endowed with the power to produce whatever its owner desired. Its association with Pluton directly linked him to this powerful life-sustaining and wealth-generating symbolism. He might also be depicted alongside Persephone, their joint presence emphasizing their shared dominion over the cycles of earthly fertility. His appearance in these Pluton contexts might be less sternly forbidding than when he is simply Hades, perhaps portrayed as a more mature, bearded, and royally dignified king, a bestower of bounty rather than just a receiver of souls. The precise theological relationship and the historical developmental origins of Hades as the grim, feared ruler of the deceased versus Pluton as the more benevolent, wealth-bestowing chthonic deity, whether they were always considered two distinct but complementary aspects of a single complex divine personality from the earliest times, or if Pluton perhaps represented an older, more agrarian-focused chthonic earth god, who was later syncretized with or partially overshadowed by the Olympian mythological figure of Hades, brother of Zeus and Poseidon, continues to be a nuanced subject explored by scholars of Greek mythology, religion, and cultic practices. This Platonic aspect Egeria is absolutely crucial to understanding why Hades might be considered surprisingly friendly, or at least surprisingly beneficial by the ancient Greeks. He wasn't just the god who took everything away in death. He was also, in a very real sense, the god from whose dark, hidden realm all good things, the shining metals, the precious gems, and the very sustenance of life that sprang from the fertile earth, ultimately originated. He was the quiet, unseen foundation of their prosperity, the somber king whose marriage to the goddess of spring ensured the eternal turning of the seasons and the continuation of life itself. This made him a god, to be respected, to be appeased, and in his guise as Pluton even to be gratefully invoked for blessings of abundance. You are now beginning to see Egeria, a rather more multifaceted and perhaps surprisingly less menacing portrait of Hades, the ancient Greek king of the underworld. You've explored his reluctant acquisition of that gloomy domain, the revealing euphemisms like Pluton the Rich One, that hinted at his connection to earthly wealth and agricultural bounty, his generally impartial role as the inevitable host to all departed souls, and even the stable, if somewhat somber, divine partnership he shared with his queen Persephone. All these elements chip away at the popular modern image of Hades as a purely villainous fire and brimstone type of deity. But to further refine our understanding of his true mythological role and to appreciate why he might be considered surprisingly friendly, or at least surprisingly not the primary source of active dread when it came to the actual process of dying, it's crucial to distinguish him from other, often more directly fearsome death-related entities in the Greek pantheon. Hades, you see, wasn't death itself. He was the ruler of the dead. The distinction is subtle but very important. A mainstream historical fact is that in ancient Greek mythology, the actual personification of death, the being who is generally understood to directly end a mortal's life and escort their soul, or at least oversee its departure from the world of the living, was typically not Hades himself, but a separate, distinct deity named Thanatos. Thanatos, whose name literally means death, was usually depicted as a son of Nyx night and Erebus darkness, and very significantly as the twin brother of Sleep. This twinship is wonderfully evocative, isn't it? Egeria, sleep and death, two sides of the same coin. The gentle temporary release and the ultimate permanent one. Thanatos was in essence the ancient Greek equivalent of the Grim Reaper, though perhaps with a more stylish, if still undeniably rather somber classical chiton, and possibly significantly better quality divinely crafted sandals. His job was to show up when a mortal's allotted thread of life so meticulously spun and measured by the three Moirai fates was finally cut by Atropos. He would then, often with a gentle touch or a swift unseen action, separate the soul from the body. Hades, meanwhile, was more like the extremely efficient, if somewhat overworked divine manager of the very, very large, eternally full and entirely non-profit, at least for the residents' afterlife timeshare resort. He handled the eternal bookings, the room assignments, Asphodel Elysium, or that rather less desirable basement suite in Tartarus, and the overall property management. Thanatos just handled the initial, often rather unwelcome guest arrivals. Thanatos himself was often portrayed as a stern, unyielding figure, sometimes winged, sometimes dark-robed, sometimes even as a beautiful, if somber youth. Mortals naturally feared him as he was the direct harbinger of their end, the one who physically enacted the separation from life. But even Thanatos wasn't necessarily evil in the sense of being actively malicious or delighting in causing suffering. He was simply performing his inescapable cosmic duty, a necessary part of the natural order. A quirky or fringe tidbit that illustrates Thanatos' role as a direct agent, whom one could at least in myth physically confront, comes from Euripides' play Alcestis. In this drama, the hero Heracles, in a display of his immense strength and loyalty to his friend Admetus, Alcestis' husband, famously wrestles with Thanatos himself at Alcestis' tomb, and forcibly prevents death from taking her soul, thus restoring her to life at least for a time. Notice, Egeria, that Heracles battles Thanatos, the embodiment of death, not Hades, the ruler of the already dead. Hades in this instance is not directly involved in the struggle over Alcestis' departure from life. The precise theological distinctions and the often overlapping or evolving hierarchical relationships between Hades as the supreme ruler of the underworld and these other significant chthonic or death-related divinities such as Thanatos. Death. Sleep. Hecate, goddess of magic, crossroads, and ghosts, often associated with Persephone, and the more terrifying, Charis, spirits of violent death. And exactly how these distinctions were understood in nuanced popular Greek religious belief versus their portrayal in more systematized mythological narratives or philosophical treatises are complex areas of ongoing study and interpretation for classicists and historians of ancient religion. Speaking of the Charis, these were another set of death-related entities from whom Hades should be clearly distinguished if we are to understand his relatively less malevolent role. The Charis were not like the impartial Thanatos who simply enacted the end of a natural lifespan. Oh no. The Charis were the terrifying dark-winged female spirits of violent or cruel death. The personifications of doom, battlefield slaughter, and devastating plague. They were actively malevolent, depicted as delighting in bloodshed, hovering over battlefields to snatch away the souls of the slain, or bringing swift agonizing ends to mortals through disease or accident. They were figures of pure, unadulterated dread, the ancient Greek equivalent of particularly nasty, bloodthirsty death specters. If Thanatos was the official, if somewhat gloomy divine escort service to the afterlife, then the Charis were like the terrifying, entirely unwelcome, and generally quite messy party crashers of death, specializing in violent, untimely ends, and generally making everyone's last few moments on Earth as unpleasant and terrifying as divinely possible. Hades, as the ruler of the underworld, would certainly receive the souls brought in by the Charis, just as he received all others, but he was not a Charis himself. He didn't revel in violence or actively seek to inflict such horrifying deaths upon mortals. Similarly, we must distinguish Hades from the Erinyes, or the Furies, those ancient snake-haired avengers of blood guilt. The Erinyes, as we've touched upon, pursued and relentlessly punished those mortals guilty of specific heinous crimes against the natural or moral order, particularly patricide, matricide, the killing of kin, or the breaking of sacred oaths. While they often resided in the depths of the underworld, particularly in Tartarus, where they might oversee the torments of the damned. They were distinct agents of divine vengeance, often acting on behalf of cosmic justice or the curses of wronged individuals, rather than as direct subordinates of Hades carrying out his personal whims. Hades maintained the prison, as it were. The Furies were more like the terrifying, inescapable internal affairs. Investigators and divine enforcers of particularly severe sentences for specific moral crimes. By separating Hades from these more active, often more directly frightening or malevolent personifications of death, violence, or vengeance, his own role comes into sharper and perhaps friendlier focus. He wasn't out there on the battlefields like the Charis, nor was he chasing down oathbreakers like the Furies. He wasn't even the one like Thanatos who usually had to deliver the bad news about your mortal lease being up. Hades was for the most part a remarkably stationary deity residing in his shadowy palace, overseeing his vast domain and ensuring that the fundamental rule, what goes down stays down, was upheld. His friendliness, then, if we can call it that, lies in this very predictability. This lack of active malice, this commitment to order, however gloomy that order might be. He wasn't actively trying to cause trouble for the living. He was merely the steadfast, if somber manager of a very, very large and eternally full celestial hotel for the permanently checked out. Front desk of Hades and Persephone Palace Suites. A harried underworld administrative assistant might answer the ethereal phone. This is Hades speaking from the main throne room. We appear to have another rather large influx of newly deceased shades. Arriving at the River Styx, Hermes is looking a bit frazzled, and Charon is complaining that his ore has developed a splinter again. Could someone please send down an extra supply of ethereal intake forms, a fresh batch of lethe water, and perhaps a slightly larger, more Cerberus-resistant welcome mat for the main gates? It's going to be another long eternity down here. His concerns were largely administrative, ensuring the smooth, orderly processing of souls into their designated afterlife accommodations. You are now, Egeria, beginning to see Hades in a somewhat different, perhaps less conventionally terrifying light. You understand that he was not death itself, that rather more direct and often unwelcome personal envoy was usually Thanatos. Nor was Hades one of the actively malevolent Charis, those dark-winged spirits of violent doom, or even one of the dread Erinyes, the relentless avengers of blood guilt, though they all operated within or had access to his vast shadowy domain. Hades, as we've established, was primarily the stern, unyielding, but largely impartial king of the underworld. The divine administrator of the dead, the one who ensured that the great inexorable cycle of life and mortality proceeded according to cosmic law. So given this more nuanced understanding of his role, how did the ancient Greeks actually feel about him? Was it pure, unadulterated terror, or was their attitude, like the god himself, a little more complex? A mainstream historical fact is that while the ancient Greeks certainly viewed Hades and his gloomy realm with a profound sense of awe and an entirely natural human fear of death and the unknown that lay beyond it, their attitude was generally one of deep, almost cautious respect for a powerful and necessary chthonic deity who upheld a crucial aspect of cosmic order. They did not typically perceive him as a purely evil or actively demonic figure seeking to harm humanity out of sheer malice in the way some later religious traditions might depict their rulers of the underworld. The ancient Greek attitude towards Hades Egeria was basically, "We respect you immensely, sir. You have a very important, if undeniably rather depressing and generally quite drafty job to do. We acknowledge your immense power and your non-negotiable claim on us all eventually. Now, if it's all the same to you, we'd really prefer it if you largely stayed down there in your magnificent, if somewhat light-challenged subterranean palace and didn't come up here for too many unexpected social calls or surprise recruitment drives for your kingdom. No offense intended whatsoever. Of course, please enjoy your eternal reign, and we'll try not to think about you too much until we absolutely have to." This respectful caution is powerfully evident in their widespread reluctance to speak his primary name, Idoneus, the Unseen One, or even Hades too directly or too casually. As we explored with those fascinating euphemistic epithets, they much preferred to address him or refer to him by more auspicious or at least more neutral titles like Pluton the Rich One, Clymenus the Renowned, or Eubuleus of Good Counsel. This wasn't necessarily because they believed that uttering his true name would instantly cause him to materialize before them in a puff of sulfurous smoke and drag them off to the asphodel meadows before their appointed time. Though one can imagine a certain superstitious frisson around the idea. Rather, it was a profound mark of respect for his fearsome power, a way of acknowledging his somber domain without wishing to draw its immediate personal attention. It was like not wanting to shout fire in a crowded theater, or perhaps more accurately, not wanting to casually mention the name of the most powerful, most feared, and the most reclusive CEO in the entire cosmic corporation, when you're just a humble intern in the mortal realm. Better to refer to him as the boss downstairs, or Mr. Subterranean Property Magnate and Chief Soul Administrator, and hope he was far too busy with his eternal paperwork and overseeing the ferry schedules of Karen to notice your insignificant utterance. This attitude of awe and respectful avoidance, however, is quite different from the hatred, revulsion, or active moral condemnation that would be directed towards a figure perceived as genuinely intrinsically evil. The Greeks didn't typically offer Hades the same kind of joyful, celebratory public worship that they accorded to the bright Olympian gods like Zeus Apollo or Athena, who were seen as bestowers of more immediate life-affirming blessings. But they did acknowledge his necessary place in the cosmos. He was an integral part of the divine order, established after the Titanomachy, a legitimate king ruling his own allotted domain. He wasn't a rebel against Zeus, nor was he usually depicted as actively trying to tempt mortals into sin, or to corrupt the world of the living. His primary concern was his own realm, and ensuring its boundaries were maintained. The precise balance in popular ancient Greek perception between Hades as the feared and somber lord of a gloomy afterlife and his alter ego Pluton as the more benevolent giver of subterranean wealth and agricultural fertility, and whether these two aspects were always fully integrated in the minds of most Greeks, or perhaps appealed to different segments of society or were invoked in entirely different cultic contexts and for different ritual purposes, remains a nuanced and fascinating area of ongoing study for historians of Greek popular religion and ancient belief systems. A quirky or fringe tidbit that speaks to the complex, sometimes even surprisingly domestic, view of Hades and Persephone comes from their portrayal in certain local cults or even in some artistic depictions. While their marriage began with that rather dramatic abduction, they are often shown as a stable, if somber, royal couple ruling their realm together. And as we've noted, Hades, unlike his notoriously philandering brothers Zeus and Poseidon, was remarkably, almost uniquely faithful to his queen. This divine marital stability, this lack of chaotic romantic entanglements, and the endless stream of disgruntled divine spouses and illegitimate demigod offspring that so often characterized Olympian family life might have contributed at least subtly to a perception of Hades as a more steadfast, predictable, and perhaps, even in his own grim way, a more reliable and less personally troublesome deity than some of his more emotionally volatile relatives upstairs on Mount Olympus. He wasn't actively out there causing romantic drama and turning unsuspecting mortals into cows or spiders just because he was having a bad day or had taken a sudden fancy to someone. He was, for the most part, just quietly getting on with his very important, if eternally rather gloomy job. So was Hades friendly in the sense of being your cheerful, backslapping divine best mate who'd invite you over for a lively game of celestial knucklebones and a bottomless amphora of ambrosia cake? Probably not Egeria. His idea of a good time was likely ensuring all the shades were correctly filed, and Cerberus had enough spectral bones to chew on. But crucially, he also wasn't generally out there actively trying to smite you with a plague of existential dread or curse your lineage for 7 generations just because you happened to look at him sideways or forgot to offer him the biggest slice of the sacrificial goat. In the often dramatic, emotionally volatile, and sometimes frankly quite terrifying world of the Greek gods being predictably gloomy but generally fair and not actively trying to ruin your life for no good reason, was practically best friend material by comparison. His realm was one of justice in its own way. The wicked were punished in Tartarus, the virtuous rewarded in Elysium, and the vast majority found their neutral place in the asphodel meadows, all under his overarching impartial rule administered by the stern judges of the dead. He upheld the laws of fate and the decrees of the cosmos concerning mortality. This adherence to order, this lack of divine caprice in his dealings with the dead, could be seen as a form of grim but ultimately fair divine governance. So while the ancient Greeks undoubtedly approached Hades with a profound sense of awe, a natural human trepidation, in the face of death and the unknown, it was a respect born of his immense power and his inescapable role, not necessarily a hatred or revulsion, directed at a figure of pure, unadulterated evil. He was the unseen king, the host to many, the giver of hidden wealth, a complex, somber, but essential deity in their understanding of the world and the afterlife. You've now come to understand, Egeria, that the ancient Greek attitude towards Hades, the stern but largely impartial king of the underworld, was far more complex than simple, unadulterated terror. It was a nuanced blend of awe for his immense and inescapable power, a natural human fear of death and the shadowy unknown, and a quiet respect for his role in maintaining cosmic order. They acknowledged his dominion, often preferring to address him by euphemistic titles like Pluton the Rich One, to emphasize his connection to earthly wealth and agricultural bounty, rather than directly invoking the more somber aspects of his reign. But how did this rather unique, respectfully cautious attitude translate into actual religious practice? Did the Greeks build magnificent, sun-drenched temples to Hades, filled with joyful worshippers and fragrant sacrificial smoke, as they did for his Olympian siblings, Zeus, Apollo, or Athena? Or was the worship of this unseen king as hidden, as chthonic as his realm itself? A mainstream historical fact is that public cults and grand prominent temples, dedicated specifically and solely to Hades, were relatively rare in the ancient Greek world, especially when compared to the ubiquitous sanctuaries honoring the major Olympian deities. While he was undeniably a great and powerful god, one of the three supreme brothers who divided the cosmos, mortals, were generally quite reluctant to draw his direct personal attention, too often or too conspicuously. It's like having a very important, very powerful, and slightly intimidating landlord who owns the entire subterranean foundation of your existence. You acknowledge his ownership, you pay your dues in this case, your eventual mortality, but you don't necessarily want to invite him over for tea and crumpets every Tuesday, or build a giant, brightly lit welcome center right outside his main, and preferably for you, mostly closed door. The ancient Greeks, it seems, figured that building a lot of magnificent, highly visible temples for Zeus, Athena, Apollo, and the rest of the Olympian party crowd was an excellent idea. Keep them happy, keep the blessings flowing. But for Hades, his temple was probably more along the lines of a very discreet, tastefully gloomy, and exceptionally well soundproofed basement apartment, perhaps with a subtle, understated sign saying, Hades, Pluton LLC Afterlife Administration and Subterranean Resource Management. Appointments not generally necessary, we'll call you. Less was definitely considered more when it came to actively soliciting the presence of the Lord of the Dead in your daily life. This doesn't mean Hades was entirely without worship or sacred spaces. His cult, however, was often more private, more localized, or integrated into broader, chthonic, underworld-related rituals, funerary practices, and certain mystery cults, rather than being the focus of large celebratory state festivals in the same way as, say, the Panathenaea for Athena or the Olympia for Zeus. His worship often centered on places believed to have a direct connection to the underworld. Deep caves, fissures in the earth, certain sacred groves or springs whose waters were thought to emerge from his subterranean realm. These locations, often possessing a naturally numinous, eerie, or awe-inspiring quality, could become sites for offering prayers and sacrifices to Hades, Pluton, and other chthonic deities. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that at some specific sites, believed to be actual entrances to the underworld, such as certain dark caves in remote regions, or the famous Necromantion of Ephyra on the Acheron River, an oracle of the dead, where people went to try and communicate with the spirits of their departed loved ones. Very particular, often somber and nocturnal rituals were performed. These were not joyful sunlit ceremonies. They were serious shadowy affairs designed to appease the powers of the underworld and facilitate a fleeting, fragile connection with the realm of the shades. Funerary rites themselves were, in a very real sense, a primary form of acknowledging Hades' dominion and appeasing his power. The proper burial of the dead with all its prescribed rituals, the washing and dressing of the body, the lamentations, the placement of Charon's obol in the mouth, the procession to the grave, the offerings of food and drink basins poured out for the deceased. All these were performed not just out of respect for the departed soul, but also to ensure its safe and peaceful passage into Hades' kingdom, and to ensure that it stayed there without troubling the living. These rites implicitly honored Hades as the one who received and kept the dead. festivals for the dead, such as the Anthesteria in Athens, which had a day dedicated to the spirits of the departed. The Chois, or pitcher feast, Wadais, when the ghosts were believed to wander, the city also involved rituals and offerings intended to appease the souls in Hades' care, and by extension, the chthonic powers themselves. When sacrifices were made directly to Hades or Pluton, they often had distinct characteristics that set them apart from Olympian sacrifices. The sacrificial animals were frequently black, perhaps a black sheep, a black bull, or black piglets, symbolizing the darkness of his realm. The sacrifice was often performed with the animal's head turned downwards towards the earth, and its blood was allowed to flow into a pit, bathros, or trench dug in the ground so it could reach the underworld deities. These rituals were typically performed at night or in a very somber, quiet atmosphere with averted gazes, as mortals were generally quite keen to avoid making direct, unshielded eye contact with the chthonic powers. If you were sacrificing to Hades Egeria, you certainly wouldn't bring your prize-winning snow-white, exceptionally fluffy and cheerful-looking lamb that had just won most adorable ovine at the local village fair. Oh no. You'd bring your moodiest, most existentially angsty, preferably entirely black sheep, the one that always looked like it was contemplating the inherent futility of existence, and was probably already halfway to the Asphodel Meadows in spirit anyway. Very on brand for appealing to the Lord of the Underworld. The precise balance and inner relationship between the official state-sanctioned cults of the major Olympian deities, which often emphasize civic prosperity, victory, and the bright aspects of life, and the often more localized, private, or mystery cult-based veneration of chthonic gods like Hades, Pluton, and the overall religious life of ancient Greek communities, and the extent to which popular piety and everyday religious practice might have differed significantly from the grand, state-sponsored temple rituals in these complex regards remains a nuanced and actively researched area of study for historians of Greek religion and social anthropology. The priests of Hades, if such a distinct, formalized priesthood was widespread, were certainly far less prominent or numerous than the priests and priestesses serving the great Olympian temples. His cult might have been tended by specific families with hereditary connections to a local chthonic shrine, or by priests associated with oracles of the dead or certain hero cults that had strong underworld associations. Being a priest of Hades was probably a rather niche and perhaps somewhat socially isolating career choice in ancient Greece. So, tell me, Eubulos, a fellow Greek might inquire at a non-Hades-related social gathering, what exactly do you do for a living? Oh, you know, Eubulos might reply with a slightly forced, gloomy smile. I mostly hang out in rather dimly lit, drafty caves, accept solemn offerings of black sheep and particularly mournful-looking pomegranates, and occasionally try to interpret the significance of the ominous groans and unsettling subterranean rumbles that emanate from the earth as divine pronouncements from the unseen king. The hours are exceptionally flexible, really. And the company, it must be said, is very, very quiet. Mostly. This hidden or less prominent nature of Hades' formal public cult makes perfect sense given the Greek attitude towards him. He wasn't a god from whom you actively sought daily. Favors blessings for your crops unless you were addressing him as Pluton, specifically for earthly fertility or victory in battle. He was the god whose attention you generally hoped to avoid for as long as humanly possible. His primary role was to receive you at the very end of your life. Therefore, his worship was more about appeasement, about acknowledging his inevitable power, about ensuring the proper care of the dead, and about invoking his more benevolent plutonic aspect for earthly riches, rather than about building grand sunlit temples in the heart of every city to constantly remind everyone of their ultimate shadowy destination. The peculiar nature of his worship then lay in this very reticence, this respectful distance, this understanding that some divine powers are best honored quietly and from afar. You are now Egeria, comfortably familiar with the ancient Greek reluctance to build grand sunlit temples directly in honor of Hades, or to invoke his more somber name too casually in everyday conversation. You understand that his worship, when it occurred, was often more private, more chthonic, focused on appeasing the powers of the underworld, ensuring the peaceful rest of the departed, or perhaps when addressing him as Pluton, seeking the hidden bounties of the earth. He was a god best acknowledged with respectful caution, and generally kept at a safe subterranean distance. But what happened when living mortals, particularly those larger-than-life figures of Greek mythology, the heroes had cause to deliberately venture into his shadowy domain to knock, as it were, on Hell's very gate? These rare and perilous encounters, Egeria offer some of our most vivid and often quite revealing insights into Hades' character as a ruler. Stern certainly, but often surprisingly rule-bound, and not necessarily the actively malevolent adversary one might expect. A descent into the underworld known in Greek as a katabasis was a recurring and incredibly potent theme in ancient Greek mythology. It was the ultimate heroic trial, a journey into the very heart of darkness and death, undertaken only by the bravest, most resourceful, or most divinely favored, or sometimes most divinely cursed individuals. The purposes for such a terrifying expedition varied to rescue a loved one from death, to gain profound, otherwise unattainable knowledge or prophecy from the shades of the wise, or in some cases to perform a seemingly impossible labor set by gods or kings. And any such journey by definition involved a direct or indirect encounter with the authority of Hades, the unseen king, and the strict laws of his realm. One of the most famous heroic visitors to the underworld was of course the mighty Heracles Hercules to the Romans as part of his 12 labors imposed by King Eurystheus. His final most daunting task was to capture and bring back Cerberus Hades' monstrous, three-headed guard dog from the very gates of the underworld without using any weapons. Imagine Heracles Egeria arriving at the obsidian palace of Hades, probably after a rather challenging negotiation with Charon the ferryman, who likely demanded a significantly higher fare for a living passage in Nayakambaitan, especially one of Heracles' impressive and presumably rather boat-rocking physique, and a quick friendly chat with Cerberus, which probably involved Heracles demonstrating his superior chokehold technique. He now stands before the shadowed thrones of Hades and Persephone. "Greetings, Lord Hades, Queen Persephone," Heracles might announce with his characteristic, if perhaps slightly strained, heroic bravado. "So, about my 12th labor. I'm here to, just casually borrow your exceptionally large, famously ferocious triple-headed guard dog for a brief, entirely non-destructive meet and greet with my cousin Eurystheus up in Tyrans. I promise to return him with all his heads still firmly attached and only slightly more bad-tempered than usual." "We good?" Hades, one imagines, probably just sighed that deep, world-weary subterranean sigh of his. Not another one of Zeus's overachieving, rule-bending sons trying to mess with my carefully established underworld security protocols and my perfectly well-behaved guard dog, he might think. "Fine, but absolutely no weapons, Heracles. You subdue him with your bare hands. And if he happens to shed excessively on the asphodel meadows on the way out, or accidentally eats any of the more important, recently deceased philosophical shades, you are entirely responsible for the celestial paperwork and the subsequent deep cleaning." In most versions of the myth, Hades, sometimes after a brief wrestling match between Heracles and Cerberus, or perhaps with the gentle intercession of Persephone, does indeed grant Heracles permission to take the fearsome hound provided he can master it without weapons. Heracles being Heracles succeeds. Hades, true to his word, if perhaps a little grudgingly, allows the hero to depart with his prize. This encounter shows Hades as stern certainly, but also as a god who, when faced with overwhelming divine sanction, Heracles was after all performing labors set in motion by Hera and Zeus, or irresistible heroic might, will ultimately adhere to the rules of the encounter. The symbolic significance of these heroic katabasis narratives in Greek mythology, whether they primarily represent ancient shamanistic journeys undertaken to acquire forbidden knowledge or retrieve lost souls, intricate psychological explorations of the human confrontation with mortality and the potential for spiritual rebirth, dramatic triumphs over the very forces of death itself, or perhaps even allegorical representations of initiatory rites within specific mystery cults. And precisely how Hades' role within these terrifying descents is portrayed as an implacable adversary, a neutral but unyielding gatekeeper, or even in very rare instances a reluctant grantor of seemingly impossible boons, often varies considerably across different myths, literary genres, and subsequent scholarly interpretations. Another deeply poignant encounter with the rulers of the underworld is that of Orpheus, the legendary musician whose song could charm trees, rocks, and even wild beasts when his beloved wife, the nymph Eurydice, tragically dies from a snakebite, Orpheus, in his overwhelming grief, resolves to do what no mortal had successfully done before, to descend into Hades and persuade its rulers to release her soul. He makes his way past Charon and Cerberus, his mournful music softening even their grim resolve. He arrives before the thrones of Hades and Persephone, and there he sings his song of love and loss, a melody so beautiful, so heartbreaking, that it moves the entire underworld to tears. Even the tormented shades in Tartarus briefly pause in their eternal punishments. The Furies themselves weep. And most remarkably, the stern, implacable hearts of Hades and Persephone are touched. Orpheus plays his lyre so exquisitely, Egeria his voice so filled with sorrow and longing, that even the normally quite stoic Queen Persephone is seen dabbing at her shadowy eyes with a delicate, cobweb-thin handkerchief, and King Hades himself is observed to clear his throat rather more frequently than is strictly necessary for a god of his solemn dignity. All right, fine, you incredibly talented, if somewhat overly emotional mortal musician. Hades might finally concede, perhaps after a significant, meaningful nudge from his visibly moved queen. You can have her back. Your song has temporarily disrupted our usually quite efficient underworld workflow with all this unseemly weeping. But there is one very strict, non-negotiable condition. You must lead her out, and you must not under any circumstances look back at her until you have both fully reached the sunlight of the upper world. One glance, Orpheus, just one tiny peek before you're clear and the deal is off and she remains here forever. Are we understood? Orpheus, overjoyed, agrees. But then in that famously tragic moment, just as he is about to step into the light, overcome by doubt and longing, he turns to look back at Eurydice, and she is instantly, irrevocably pulled back into the shadows. In this tale, Hades again shows a capacity for making a concession, for bending his own strict rules. Allowing a soul to potentially leave is a huge deal for him. But he also sets a firm, unbreakable condition. The ultimate tragedy is Orpheus's human failing, his inability to trust and obey not any particular malice or trickery on Hades' part in this instance. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that in some artistic depictions of Heracles' encounter with Cerberus or Orpheus's plea, Hades and Persephone are shown looking on from their thrones, sometimes with expressions of regal composure, sometimes with a hint of surprise or even a touch of something akin to divine curiosity at these audacious mortal visitors rather than just outright hostility. It's almost as if they're thinking, well, this is certainly an unexpected and rather disruptive addition to our usual Tuesday afternoon schedule of processing newly arrived, rather gloomy shades, but he is Zeus's favorite son. His music is undeniably rather good. Let's see how this plays out. Odysseus, in his famous Nekia, or Book of the Dead in the Odyssey, also journeys to the entrances of the underworld. Not to confront Hades directly, but to consult the shade of the blind prophet Tiresias. This episode again highlights the underworld as a source of profound, otherwise inaccessible knowledge and prophecy. These encounters, Egeria with heroes at Hell's Gate, consistently portray Hades not as a proactive force of evil seeking to destroy them, but as the stern, rule-bound guardian of his domain. A king whose laws are absolute, whose realm is inescapable, but who, on very rare, divinely sanctioned or exceptionally musically persuasive occasions, might just reveal a sliver of something that could almost, if you squint very hard in the Stygian gloom, resemble a peculiar form of grimy, reluctant friendliness, or at least a grudging adherence to the rules of a very serious cosmic game. The Underworld, after all, wasn't exactly a popular holiday destination for a weekend getaway. No 5-star reviews on ye old TripAdvisor to Hades and the Asphodel Meadows experience. But if you were a particularly determined hero with a very important, often divinely sanctioned quest, you might get a temporary visitor's pass. Just don't expect a complimentary welcome drink upon arrival, unless of course it's a refreshing cup of water from the river Lethe, which, as we know, is generally not recommended if you actually want to remember why you came in the first place. You have now Egeria accompanied some of ancient Greece's most renowned heroes, the mighty Heracles, the musically gifted Orpheus, the cunning Odysseus, on their perilous, if often divinely sanctioned descents into the shadowy realm of Hades. You've seen how the king of the underworld in these encounters typically acted not as a gratuitously cruel adversary, but as a stern, rule-bound guardian of his domain, sometimes even capable of a grudging concession, when faced with irresistible divine will, overwhelming heroic might, or exceptionally beautiful lute playing, though that last one probably required some serious spousal persuasion from Queen Persephone. These mythological interactions further nuance our understanding of Hades, distancing him from the simplistic image of a purely malevolent overlord. And this brings us, Egeria, to a crucial point in our sleepy exploration: the need to firmly dispel those persistent, often anachronistic modern myths that tend to equate the ancient Greek Hades with later very different conceptions of a tempting demonic ruler of a fiery hell. In short, Hades was no devil. Hades, a mainstream historical fact and one that often gets muddled in popular culture, is that the ancient Greek god Hades, as ruler of the Underworld, which also bore his name, was a distinct mythological figure with his own specific domain responsibilities and characteristics within the Greek pantheon. He should not be anachronistically conflated with the figure of Satan or the devil, as found in later Abrahamic religious traditions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam. Hades, in the classical Greek understanding, was not typically portrayed as a source of ultimate evil, a cosmic adversary to a supreme good deity, a tempter of mortals towards sin, or a fallen angel leading a rebellion against divine authority. The common modern perception of Hades, as we touched upon in our very first sleepy musings, often paints him as a cackling, horned, pitchfork-wielding, fire and brimstone kind of villain gleefully presiding over a realm of eternal torment for all, and perhaps constantly plotting to overthrow his brother Zeus and seize control of Mount Olympus. This image, Egeria, is largely a product of later cultural syncretism, medieval and Renaissance artistic depictions of hell, influenced by Christian theology like Dante's Inferno, and of course countless subsequent movies, comic books, and video games that have found a convenient, if historically inaccurate, antagonist in this Lord of the Dead. Hades' original PR, you see, has suffered from some serious long-term brand confusion. He wasn't out there with a tiny, pointy pitchfork, actively trying to tempt virtuous mortals into signing shady, soul-binding contracts in exchange for, say, a slightly used but surprisingly fast chariot, or a lifetime supply of really good olives. His main concerns were far more administrative and significantly less interventionist. It was more along the lines of, right has the ferryman Charon remembered to submit his weekly obol accounts on time, and who for the love of Styx left the main gate to Tartarus slightly ajar again. The paperwork for escaped titans is an absolute bureaucratic nightmare, I tell you. Let's consider some of the key differences. Firstly, origin and role. Hades, as one of the three great sons of Cronus and Rhea, was a legitimate Olympian-era god who received his domain, the Underworld, by lot after the victory over the Titans. He was an integral part of the established divine order, not a rebel against it. Satan, in many Christian traditions, is often conceived as a fallen angel, an adversary of God, a force of active evil opposing divine goodness. Hades was simply fulfilling his assigned cosmic function. Secondly, motivation. Hades' primary motivation was to rule his realm, to keep the dead within its bounds, and to maintain the natural order of life and death. He didn't generally seek to actively tempt mortals into wrongdoing, or to drag their souls down to his kingdom before their allotted time was up. He wasn't offering Faustian bargains or trying to corrupt humanity for the sheer fiendish fun of it. His interactions with the living were rare and usually initiated by them like those heroes on their quest. The Christian devil, on the other hand, is often portrayed as a tempter actively working to lead humanity astray and into sin. Thirdly, the nature of his realm. As we've explored, the Greek underworld, also called Hades, was a complex place with different regions. There were the gloomy but neutral asphodel meadows for ordinary shades, the blissful Elysian fields for heroes, and the virtuous and the terrible abyss of Tartarus for the punishment of truly great sinners and defeated divine enemies like the Titans. It wasn't solely a place of universal fiery torment for everyone who wasn't a follower of a specific faith, as hell is often conceived in some later traditions. If you were expecting Hades' entire kingdom to be a non-stop inferno of fire, brimstone, and heavy metal album cover art, you'd be mostly disappointed, Egeria. It was generally much more understatedly gloomy. More endless, slightly damp, and profoundly boring misty fields, with a persistent background hum of very faint mournful sighing than highway to an eternally flaming bad place. Tartarus was the truly nasty neighborhood, but that was reserved for a very select, very unfortunate clientele. Fourthly, Hades' relationship with the other gods. While he was certainly a somber and somewhat aloof figure, rarely attending the boisterous parties on Mount Olympus, he probably found them intolerably cheerful and far too brightly lit. He was still part of the Olympian family structure. He was Zeus's brother, Persephone's husband, Demeter's son-in-law. A rather strained relationship, that one admittedly. He wasn't leading a cosmic rebellion against Zeus, he was ruling his own recognized, if less desirable, third of the universe. And fifthly, he didn't command an army of demons in the same sense that a later devil figure might. He had his ministers and denizens of the underworld. Thanatos, death. Hypnos, sleep, Charon, the ferryman Cerberus, his guard dog, the judges of the dead, and the Erinyes Furies, who acted as enforcers of a specific kind of justice for blood guilt and oath-breaking. But these were all part of the established cosmic order, fulfilling their designated roles, not a host of fallen angels, actively warring against the forces of good. A quirky or fringe tidbit that further distinguishes Hades from later demonic figures is the almost complete lack of myths about mortals selling their soul to Hades in exchange for worldly power, riches, or forbidden knowledge. That's a trope far more associated with medieval and later Faustian legends concerning the devil. Hades wasn't really in the business of soul bartering with the living. He knew he'd get your soul eventually free of charge once the fates were done with you. He had a guaranteed supply. There was no need for aggressive acquisition strategies or tricky contractual negotiations involving your eternal essence in a first-class ticket to perdition. The complex historical and theological process by which various chthonic underworld deities from diverse pagan pantheons, including powerful but not necessarily evil figures like the Greco-Roman Hades, Pluto, were gradually demonized, assimilated into, or used as visual or conceptual templates for the figure of a singular supremely malevolent devil or Satan within developing Christian theology and subsequent popular European folklore and art is a fascinating multi-layered and often quite contentious subject. Studied by theologians, historians of religion, comparative mythologists, and folklorists tracing the intricate evolution of eschatological beliefs and personifications of evil across cultures and centuries. So, if Hades ever got an accidental invitation to some kind of interpantheon, villains, underworld rulers, and assorted agents of general malevolence anonymous, meeting Egeria, he'd probably be sitting in a corner looking rather out of place and slightly bewildered. Wait a minute, Amadaja, he might rumble to the assembled collection of fiends, demons, and fallen angels. You guys actively try to make mortals miserable before they die, and you're all apparently very keen on overthrowing the head god and taking over the entire cosmos. That all sounds remarkably energetic and frankly like an awful lot of unnecessary paperwork. I mostly just want everyone to file their death certificates correctly, ensure Cerberus doesn't eat the celestial mailman, and perhaps persuade Persephone that another 6 months of pomegranate-based interior decorating in the palace is entirely sufficient for this millennium. Very different management styles, I suppose, and much less ambitious quarterly targets. He was in essence a god of order, albeit a very dark and final order, not an agent of chaos or intrinsic evil. This understanding is key to appreciating any surprisingly friendly, or at least surprisingly fair aspects of his reign. You have now, Egeria, gently dispelled many of the fiery demonic misconceptions that often cling to the modern image of Hades, the ancient Greek king of the underworld. You've seen him not as an active instigator of evil or a gleeful tormentor of souls, but rather as a stern, just, and largely impartial administrator of his vast, shadowy domain, a deity who, unlike many of his more flamboyant Olympian relatives, generally preferred to keep to himself and meticulously uphold the established cosmic order. He wasn't out there trying to tempt mortals into lives of sin, or to prematurely drag them down to his kingdom. His primary concern was ensuring that those who had completed their mortal journey arrived safely, were judged fairly by his appointed judges at least, and most importantly stayed put. The fundamental rule of Hades' realm was, once you're in, you're in. No unauthorized exits, no revolving doors, no weekend passes back to the sunlit world. But what happened on those exceptionally rare, almost legendary occasions when mortals or even other gods attempted to cheat death, to retrieve a soul from his grasp, or to otherwise disrupt the unyielding laws of his domain? How did Hades, this surprisingly rule-bound monarch, react to such audacious challenges? A mainstream historical fact is that while the return of a soul from the Greek underworld was considered an almost impossible feat, an extraordinary transgression against the natural and divine order, Greek mythology does contain several famous tales of heroes or divinely favored individuals who attempted it, or who otherwise had significant dealings with the Lord of the Dead regarding the release of a shade. These myths, such as those of Orpheus and Eurydice, Alcestis, Sisyphus, and even Heracles in his final labor, often highlight not just the hero's daring, but also the unyielding nature of death's laws. And very revealingly, Hades' typical reactions, which were often stern and bound by precedent or divine agreement, rather than driven by capricious cruelty. Trying to sneak someone out of Hades' realm after they've officially checked in and their otherworldly paperwork has been processed, that's like attempting to quietly liberate a particularly valuable gold ingot from Fort Knox, using only a charming smile and a very small, slightly bent teaspoon. All while the warden, who happens to be an incredibly powerful and notoriously rule-abiding, chthonic deity with a three-headed guard dog that has an excellent sense of smell and absolutely no appreciation for unauthorized departures, is watching you with his unblinking shadowy gaze. Generally not a recommended strategy for a long and happy afterlife. Let's revisit the poignant tale of Orpheus, the divinely gifted musician, and his beloved wife, Eurydice. When Eurydice tragically dies from a snakebite on their wedding day, Orpheus, inconsolable, resolves to do the unthinkable, descend into the underworld and plead for her return. His music, so beautiful it could charm wild beasts and make trees weep, works its magic even in the gloomiest depths of Hades. He softens the heart of Charon, lulls the fearsome Cerberus to sleep, and even, it is said, causes the tormented shades in Tartarus to briefly pause in their eternal suffering. He arrives before the thrones of Hades and Persephone and sings his lament, a song of such profound love and sorrow that even the stern king and his often melancholic queen are visibly moved. Or perhaps more pragmatically, Persephone, remembering her own rather abrupt arrival in the underworld, felt a particular pang of sympathy and gave Hades a significant queenly nudge under the obsidian throne. Hades, in a rare display of something akin to divine clemency, agrees to allow Eurydice to return to the world of the living. But, and this is crucial, Egeria, he imposes one very specific, unalterable condition. Orpheus must lead Eurydice out, and he must not, under any circumstances, look back at her until they have both fully emerged into the sunlight. Orpheus, overjoyed, agrees. But then in that famously tragic moment of human frailty, just as he is about to step into the light, overcome by doubt, and an irresistible longing to ensure she is still following, he turns and looks back. And Eurydice, with a faint sorrowful sigh, is instantly irrevocably pulled back into the shadows, lost to him forever. In this, Hades is not depicted as tricking Orpheus or acting with malice. He made a concession, set a clear rule, and when Orpheus, through his own human weakness, broke that rule, Hades simply and unyieldingly enforced the consequence. He was a stickler for the rules, our Hades. Oh, you charmed my famously stoic wife with your heart-wrenching lute music and your rather impressive display of poetic grief, and I, in a moment of uncharacteristic divine magnanimity, possibly due to indigestion from last night's pomegranate seeds, agreed. To let your dearly departed girlfriend go, did I, Orpheus, fine. But the rule, as I recall, was very clearly no peeking until you were both completely out of my jurisdiction. You peeked, she's mine again. Sorry, not sorry. Do try to read the ethereal terms and conditions more carefully next time, pal. And perhaps consider a less emotionally fraught hobby like, say, pottery. Then there's the story of Alcestis, whose husband Admetus was granted the boon of avoiding his fated death if someone else would willingly die in his place. Only his devoted wife Alcestis agrees. As Thanatos, Death himself, comes to claim her, the hero Heracles, a guest in Admetus's house at the time, intervenes, wrestling with Thanatos and forcibly preventing him from taking Alcestis to the underworld. Here, Hades is not directly defied within his realm. Rather, a soul is prevented from entering it by heroic force majeure against his primary agent. It underscores that while Hades rules the dead, the act of dying itself can sometimes in myth be momentarily contested. Sisyphus, The famously cunning king of Corinth provides a more direct example of someone trying to cheat Hades. In one version of his myth, he manages to trick and chain up Thanatos. So for a time, no one on Earth could die, much to the annoyance of both Hades, whose kingdom was experiencing an unprecedented lack of new arrivals, and Ares, the god of war, whose battles were suddenly much less conclusive. Eventually, Ares frees Thanatos and Sisyphus duly dies, but his trickery continues. Having instructed his wife Merope not to perform the proper funeral rites for him, Sisyphus arrives in the underworld and complains bitterly to Persephone, or sometimes Hades himself, that he is being neglected and needs to return briefly to the upper world to instruct his wife on her duties. Permission is granted on the solemn promise that he will return. Of course, once back among the living, Sisyphus, enjoying the sunshine, promptly reneges on his promise and refuses to go back. You can just imagine Hades down in his shadowy office checking his soul intake ledger and then face-palming with a weary groan. He said he was just popping upstairs for a moment to have a stern word with his wife about the appalling lack of decent funeral honors. I can't believe we fell for that old chestnut. Right, Hermes, fetch him. And when he gets back, he's getting the special VIP eternal boulder pushing duty in the particularly drafty section of Tartarus. That'll teach him to mess with underworld management and try to exploit our surprisingly lenient temporary leave policy. Eventually, of course, Sisyphus is forcibly dragged back to the underworld and given his famous unending punishment, a clear sign that while Hades might be momentarily outwitted by exceptional mortal cunning, his laws and the laws of fate ultimately prevail. The portrayal of Hades' specific reactions to these rare attempts by mortals or heroes to cheat death or to retrieve souls from his meticulously ordered realm, whether he is depicted consistently as an implacable, unyielding enforcer of immutable cosmic laws, or if he is occasionally shown as capable of being swayed by truly exceptional circumstances. Powerful divine pleas, especially, it often seems those coming via his queen Persephone, or even in very rare instances, temporarily outwitted by extraordinary human cunning, often varies quite subtly across different mythological traditions. Specific literary interpretations and even differing artistic representations from various periods reflecting evolving ancient Greek ideas about fate, the limits of divine justice, the power of love or heroism, and the complex nature of the afterlife itself. A quirky or fringe tidbit is the ancient Greek understanding of nekia, which was a ritual for communicating with the dead, most famously performed by Odysseus in Book 11 of the Odyssey. This, however, involved summoning the shades of the departed to the very edge of the underworld, often by a pit or trench filled with sacrificial blood which they craved, allowing for a brief, ghostly conversation. It did not involve the shades fully escaping Hades' realm or rejoining the living. True permanent escape was almost entirely unheard of and would constitute a massive transgression against the fundamental order of the cosmos, something Hades as its stern guardian would resist with all his divine power. These myths of mortals and heroes cheating death, or at least attempting to Egeria, ultimately serve to reinforce Hades' primary role. He is the great unyielding constant, the lord whose rules, though sometimes tested by extraordinary love, divine trickery, or heroic, might almost invariably reassert themselves. His realm is one of finality, and his friendliness, if we can call it that, lies in the very predictability of that finality, a stark contrast to the often chaotic and emotionally driven interventions of his Olympian kin. The shadowy gates of the underworld Egeria, with the formidable three-headed Cerberus standing eternal guard, have now been approached by some of ancient Greece's most daring heroes and most heartbroken lovers. We have seen how Hades, the stern, but largely rule-bound king of this vast, inevitable domain, reacted to these extraordinary incursions, sometimes with a rare concessionary nod to overwhelming love or divine will, but always with an ultimate insistence on the unyielding laws of his realm. The dead, with very few, very temporary, and usually rather tragically fated exceptions, were meant to stay dead. This exploration of those who almost cheated death further nuances our understanding of Hades. He is not a capricious tyrant delighting in foiling mortal hopes, but rather a steadfast administrator of a fundamental cosmic principle. His realm may be one of gloom, but it is also one of profound, unwavering order. The whispers from his kingdom are not necessarily of active malevolence, but of an inescapable, impartial, and ultimately just finality. As the image of Orpheus turning back too soon, or Sisyphus beginning his eternal frustrating labor, now gently fades into the soft quiet of your own approaching slumber, may you reflect on the ancient Greek engagement with life's greatest mystery. And may your own dreams be untroubled by any need to negotiate with stern underworld deities, filled instead with peace light and the comforting assurance of a world where, at least for tonight, all is well. The shadowy, rule-bound realm of Hades' Egeria has now been tested by the audacious intrusions of heroes like Heracles and the heartbreaking pleas of lovers like Orpheus. You've seen how the king of the underworld, while unyielding in the face of broken bargains or direct challenges to his authority, as poor Sisyphus discovered for all eternity, was not always portrayed as an entirely implacable or wantonly cruel adversary. He made concessions, he adhered to condition, and he generally seemed more concerned with upholding the established laws of his domain than with inflicting unnecessary suffering upon those who, often with divine backing, sought to interact with its formidable gates. So, after journeying through his gloomy kingdom, understanding his reluctant acquisition of it, deciphering his less terrifying epithets like Pluton, distinguishing him from more actively malevolent death spirits, and witnessing his interactions with both gods and mortals, we must now directly confront the central, rather provocative premise of our sleepy tale. What precisely was the friendly factor when it came to Hades? Why wasn't he in the eyes of the ancient Greeks quite as bad as his modern, often demonic reputation might suggest? Let's be clear, Egeria friendly in this context does not mean that Hades was a cheerful, backslapping, come on down to the underworld, the ambrosia's on me, kind of deity. He wasn't organizing jolly sing-alongs in the Asphodel Meadows or hosting delightful subterranean garden parties for the recently deceased. Though Persephone might have tried seasonally, the friendliness we are exploring is of a far more subtle, more nuanced, and perhaps more accurately termed fairness or lack of active malevolence, especially when compared to the often quite dramatic, emotionally volatile, and frankly frequently rather unfair behavior of his Olympian siblings. If Hades were to fill out a divine personality questionnaire, his Tinder profile, if such a thing existed in the chthonic realm, which it most definitely did not as he was, as we've noted, surprisingly faithful to Persephone might read something like this: name Hades, aka Pluton Idoneus. Occupation king/CEO of Underworld Corp. Interests, efficient soul administration. Maintaining strict boundary controls, ensuring all paperwork is filed correctly. Long silences, ensuring Cerberus gets his daily quota of spectral chew toys. Dislikes unauthorized exits, overly emotional petitioners. Anyone who tries to bribe Karen. Looking for actually not looking. Happily, if somewhat gloomily married. Just here to make sure everyone understands I'm not actively evil, just very, very dedicated to my rather demanding eternal job. Thank you for your time. One of the primary factors contributing to this perception of Hades as not so bad was his profound impartiality and inherent justice in his core role. As we've discussed, death in the Greek worldview was the great leveler. Hades, as the receiver of all mortal souls, embodied this impartiality. He didn't discriminate. Rich or poor king or peasant hero or humble farmer, all were eventually welcomed, or at least administratively processed into his kingdom, with the same stern, unwavering efficiency. The laws of his realm, the conditions for entry that obol for Charon, and the eventual assignment to a particular afterlife region by the judges of the dead were at least in their idealized form applied without prejudice. This is a stark contrast to the often highly partisan and favorite-style interventions of the Olympian gods in mortal affairs, who frequently blessed their favorites and mercilessly tormented those who incurred their personal displeasure, often for rather trivial reasons. Furthermore, Hades' primary function was to uphold cosmic order, specifically the crucial boundary between the living and the dead. This was a vital, necessary role for the stability of the entire cosmos. By ensuring that the dead remained dead, he prevented chaos, maintained the natural cycle of life and mortality, and allowed the world of the living to function without constant spooky interference from disgruntled or overly clingy ancestral spirits. While this made him a figure of fear because no one wants to be permanently on the dead side of that boundary, it also made him a figure of a certain grim structural necessity. He was doing a tough, unpopular job, but someone had to do it to keep the universe running smoothly. Another key aspect of Hades' not-so-bad persona was his remarkable stability and lack of capricious cruelty. While Zeus was notorious for his endless amorous escapades that caused widespread divine and mortal drama, and Poseidon was known for his sudden earth-shattering tempers, Hades was generally portrayed as a remarkably consistent and emotionally stable, if perhaps consistently rather gloomy deity. He wasn't prone to flying off the handle, smiting mortals for minor slights, or engaging in petty divine squabbles that spilled over into the human world. His focus was on his own realm, his own duties. As mentioned, his marital fidelity to Persephone, once their rather dramatic union was established, is almost unique among the major male Olympian-era gods, further underscoring the sense of stability and adherence to his own commitments. While Zeus is up on Mount Olympus, busily transforming himself into various species of farm animals to pursue yet another unsuspecting nymph, and Poseidon is probably having another one of his famously dramatic, trident-waving, angry tsunami days because someone looked at his favorite sacred dolphin in a slightly disrespectful manner. Hades is just quietly, diligently down in the underworld, probably doing his annual soul inventory, meticulously checking the ethereal spreadsheets, and making sure Cerberus has enough appropriately sized chew toys to prevent any unauthorized gnawing on the gates of hell. He's the calm, boring, remarkably reliable, if undeniably rather somber elder brother of the divine dysfunctional family. Surprisingly refreshing, really, when you consider the alternatives. The nuanced interpretation of Hades' character in the vast corpus of Greek mythology, whether his sternness and unwavering impartiality should primarily be seen as a form of negative benevolence, that is a significant lack of active, capricious harm rather than positive, outgoing friendliness. A sophisticated theological rationalization of the deep-seated human fear and inevitability of death into an ordered and just cosmic system. Or if there are genuinely discernible, positive, or even beneficial attributes to be found in his specific role as Pluton, the giver of subterranean wealth, and as a steadfast, if aloof, divine ruler, continues to be a subject of diverse scholarly perspectives and rich academic exploration. Then, of course, there is his vital role as Pluton, the rich one. This aspect, as we've explored, directly connected him not just to the mineral wealth hidden within the earth, but also through Persephone and the cycle of seasons to agricultural fertility and the very bounty that sustained mortal life. In this guise, he was not a taker of life, but a giver of the earth's hidden riches, a source of prosperity to be invoked with hope rather than dread. This dual nature, stern Hades, lord of shades, and benevolent Platon, giver of wealth, allowed the Greeks to engage with this powerful chthonic deity in different ways, emphasizing the aspect most relevant to their needs or anxieties at any given time. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that the ancient Greeks sometimes performed specific apotropaic rituals, rituals designed to turn away or avert evil or harmful influences, in relation to chthonic deities like Hades. However, these were often less about aggressively combating a purely evil force, and more about respectfully acknowledging their powerful domain, appeasing them and politely requesting that they stay within their designated boundaries and not unduly trouble the world of the living. It was a kind of divine, good fences make good neighbors arrangement, a recognition of his necessary place in the cosmos, coupled with a very understandable preference for him to exercise his duties primarily from a very safe subterranean distance. Finally, Hades was not actively seeking to increase his subjects prematurely, nor was he tempting mortals into damnation. Unlike later conceptions of a devil figure who actively schemes to corrupt souls and drag them to perdition, Hades generally waited for mortals to arrive in his kingdom at their fated time as determined by the Moirai. He wasn't out there running a recruitment drive or offering special early bird discounts for eternal residency in the Asphodel Meadows. His job was to manage those who had already passed, not to hasten their arrival. So was Hades friendly in the modern sense of being warm, approachable, and generally a delightful dinner companion? Almost certainly not. But was he surprisingly friendly when compared to the often terrifying, capricious, and actively malevolent figures that can populate other mythologies' underworlds, or even when compared to the sometimes quite frankly appalling behavior of his own Olympian relatives? Yes, in that sense, his stern, rule-bound impartiality, his lack of active malice towards the living, his connection to earthly wealth as Platon, and his general tendency to just get on with his very difficult, very gloomy job, without causing too much unnecessary extra drama, could indeed be seen as surprisingly fair, surprisingly stable, and in the grand, often chaotic scheme of Greek divinity, perhaps even Surprisingly, not so bad after all. Hades. Look, I fully understand that the eternal gloom, the endless fields of slightly depressing flowers, and the rather large three-headed guard dog with a penchant for unexpected barking might give off a certain unwelcoming vibe. But in my defense, am I actively out there trying to ruin your crops with unseasonable hailstorms, smite your cities with devastating plagues for no good reason, or turn your annoying cousin into a particularly unattractive newt just for laughs? No, I am not. I simply require that you die, but only when it is your properly appointed time, and then, most importantly, that you stay dead. Is that really so much to ask of a mortal? I personally think I'm being remarkably reasonable here, all things considered. Our sleepy, shadowy pilgrimage through the ancient Greek underworld Egeria, and our gentle re-examination of its often misunderstood ruler Hades, is now drawing to its peaceful, inevitable close. We have journeyed from the common, often rather demonic modern caricature of the Lord of the Dead back through the mists of mythology to uncover a far more complex, nuanced, and perhaps as our title suggested, a surprisingly friendly, or at least surprisingly fair and not actively malevolent, divine figure. We've explored his gloomy but orderly domain, his reluctant acquisition of it through the cosmic lottery, the revealing euphemisms like Pluton that hinted at his connection to earthly wealth, his crucial distinction from more actively fearsome death-dealing entities like Thanatos or the Cares, the awe and respectful caution with which the ancient Greeks approached him, the often hidden nature of his cult, his stern but rule-bound interactions with legendary heroes who dared to venture to Hell's Gate, and his fundamental difference from later conceptions of an ultimate evil. Now, as the last shades flit through the asphodel meadows of our imagination, it is time to reflect on the enduring secret of Hades' true nature and the lasting, often quite peculiar allure of this steadfast, if somber, god of the unseen. The enduring secret of Hades' Egeria is perhaps simply this: he was a god who did his job. In a pantheon teeming with deities known for their passionate affairs, their jealous rages, their impulsive interventions in mortal lives, and their often rather self-serving agendas, Hades stands out for his remarkable consistency, his unwavering adherence to the rules of his realm, and his general disinterest in meddling with the world above, unless absolutely necessary to maintain the cosmic balance between life and death. A mainstream historical fact is that the ancient Greek god Hades, despite ruling the universally feared realm of the dead, was not traditionally viewed as an embodiment of pure active evil in the same way that later demonic figures in other mythologies came to be portrayed. His character in classical myth was more often that of a stern, aloof, unyielding, but ultimately just and rule-bound sovereign of the underworld, an essential, if grim, component of the overall cosmic order. His primary sin in the eyes of mortals was simply that he presided over death, an event all humans naturally feared and sought to postpone. His friendliness, the Sana, was never about warm smiles, comforting hugs, or cheerful divine assistance in your everyday mortal struggles. It was the friendliness of a just if somber and entirely predictable administrator. You knew where you stood with Hades. If you were dead, you belonged in his kingdom. If you were alive, he generally had no business with you, unless you were a particularly audacious hero on a divinely sanctioned quest, or perhaps his wife Persephone was due for her seasonal return to the upper world. This lack of caprice, this steadfastness, this commitment to his allotted, if rather gloomy cosmic role, can indeed be seen as a surprising and perhaps even comforting form of divine stability in a world governed by often wildly unpredictable gods. If Hades, king of the underworld, ever saw some of those later fire and brimstone cackling villain movie portrayals of himself, Egeria, he'd probably just sigh that deep, resonant subterranean sigh of his adjust. His helm of darkness with a gesture of weary resignation and mutter, "Honestly, mortals, so terribly unnecessarily dramatic. I just wanted a quiet eternity ensuring all the incoming shades had their paperwork correctly filed, and that Cerberus wasn't chewing on the good obsidian thrones again." Is that really too much to ask for a god just trying to do his job? The legacy of Hades in the Greek conception of the underworld he ruled is a complex one. While direct explicit worship of Hades himself was, as we've seen, relatively uncommon, compared to the vibrant cults of the Olympians, his presence and the reality of his realm permeated ancient Greek thought, art, and literature. The great epic poems, the tragic, plays, the philosophical dialogues. all grapple with themes of mortality, fate, justice, and the nature of the afterlife, themes inextricably linked to Hades and his domain. The ongoing scholarly reevaluation of Hades' mythological character, moving decisively beyond simplistic, often anachronistic portrayals of him as a mere villain or a Greek precursor to a later devil figure, and towards a more nuanced and historically contextualized understanding of his complex role as a chthonic king, a dispenser of subterranean wealth in his guise as Pluton, and a crucial, if somber, and often feared component of the ancient Greek divine order, reflects a broader welcome trend in classical scholarship to critically re-examine ancient deities within their original cultural, religious, and mythological contexts, free from the often distorting lens of later culturally alien interpretations. A quirky or fringe tidbit that speaks to the enduring, if often rather niche, modern fascination with Hades and his realm is the way he and Persephone sometimes appear in contemporary esoteric or neo-pagan spiritual practices. These modern reinterpretations often focus on their roles as symbols of deep psychological transformation, the mysteries of death and rebirth, the hidden riches of the subconscious, or the power of navigating darkness to find wisdom. A far cry from the simplistic god of evil caricature. The archaeological site of Delphi Egeria, as we've noted, remains one of Greece's most significant and evocative historical locations, a UNESCO World Heritage Site whose ruins still draw hundreds of thousands of visitors each year, all seeking a connection to that ancient oracular power. It's a testament to the lasting allure of these places where secrets were once whispered. Visiting the ruins of Delphi today, or perhaps the more remote and ancient site of Dodona, is still an amazing and deeply moving experience. You can almost, if you close your eyes and listen very, very carefully to the wind, sighing through the cypress trees or rustling the oak leaves, hear the faint ancient whispers of those long-ago prophetic utterances. Or maybe that's just the slightly overpriced audio guide you rented at the entrance enthusiastically narrating the history of the sacred way, in 7 different languages simultaneously, and a rather large, very excited tour group from somewhere distant, enthusiastically discussing where to find the best post-oracle authentically Greek souvlaki in the nearby modern village, still undeniably very, very atmospheric and a powerful reminder of a time when the gods were believed to speak. So the great Greek oracles are indeed long gone. Egeria, their ancient temples now mostly magnificent, sun-bleached ruins. Their powerful gods largely retired to that vast mythological theme park in the sky, occasionally making guest appearances in rather serious academic treatises or surprisingly entertaining animated children's movies. But our deep human fascination with them, with their whispered secrets, their riddling replies, their profound impact on an entire civilization, and their attempts to bridge the gap between the mortal and the divine that it seems is as eternal, as delightfully unprovable, and as endlessly debatable as a particularly well-crafted, entirely irrefutable, and utterly captivating Delphic prophecy. Some ancient secrets, it appears, just keep on whispering their enigmatic allure through the vast corridors of time, and we, their distant, sleepy descendants, just keep on trying, with a mixture of scholarly rigor and quiet wonder, to listen. The enduring secret of Hades then may be that he represents not just the fear of the unknown, but also the profound order that underlies even the greatest mysteries of existence. He was the quiet, steadfast god of the unseen, doing his often thankless but absolutely essential job. Not exactly friendly, like a playful golden retriever puppy perhaps, but definitely less of a cosmic headache and considerably more reliable than, say, his notoriously drama-prone brother Zeus on any given Tuesday afternoon. And in the often chaotic world of the Greek gods, that Egeria might just be the most surprisingly friendly trait of all. The shadowy rivers of the Greek underworld Egeria, with Charon's ferry silently gliding upon their misty waters, and the obsidian throne room of Hades and Persephone now begin to recede into the gentle darkness of our sleepy journey's end. We have wandered through the asphodel meadows, glimpsed the distant light of Elysium, and perhaps shivered just a little at the thought of Tartarus, all while coming to a new, more nuanced understanding of the stern, yet surprisingly just God who ruled this vast, inevitable domain. We've seen that Hades, far from being a one-dimensional villain, was a complex deity, the reluctant king who received his realm by lot, the impartial host to all departed souls, the steadfast if somewhat gloomy husband, the guardian of cosmic order, and in his guise as Pluton even a bestower of the earth's hidden riches. His story and the stories of those who interacted with his realm are a testament to the ancient Greek fascination with fate, justice, and the profound mysteries of life and death. The whispers from his kingdom were not always of terror, but often of an unyielding, predictable order in a world governed by frequently capricious gods. As the image of the helm of darkness and the three watchful heads of Cerberus now gently dissolves into the quiet of your own approaching slumber, may you find a peaceful appreciation for this misunderstood monarch of the shadows. And may your dreams be filled with light untroubled by any need to pay the ferryman, knowing that even in the deepest mysteries there can be a strange and quiet order.